Alexia Duval was born on February 18, 1988, in Grès-Haute-Saône, France, into a family known for its active social stance and involvement in the local community. Her mother, Isabelle Fouliot, worked for the municipal council and was involved in community activities, while her father ran a PMU bar in the town center, which became a meeting place for many residents of Grès. Alexia's family was known for its close-knit nature and mutual support, and she had an older sister with whom she had a close relationship. Alexia grew up in a stable and caring environment. She did well in school and from an early age showed organization and a desire to achieve her goals, including in her studies and sports, where she participated in school competitions, demonstrating perseverance and attention to detail even in seemingly insignificant matters. After graduating from high school, Alexia enrolled at university, where she studied education, graduating with a master's degree in educational sciences, which allowed her to choose different career paths. However, after completing her studies, she decided to go into finance and banking, joining Crédit Agricole, where she proved herself to be a disciplined employee who took a responsible approach to working with clients and internal tasks, preferring order and clear planning. Alexia combined her work with her personal interests, continuing to keep fit and running in various races, including amateur marathons where she achieved consistent results. In 2004, when Alexia was 16, she met Jonathan Daval, who was 20 at the time. They met in Grès, where Jonathan lived with his family after losing his father to a heart attack when he was a child. Jonathan grew up in a large family with 4 brothers and 2 sisters. His mother later remarried and had another child. Jonathan was known as a calm, quiet young man who was interested in technology and sports. Although he was introverted and prone to avoiding conflict, at the beginning of their relationship they spent time together, jogging, going for walks, and meeting up with friends, where they appeared to be a model of a calm and sincere relationship. Over time, their relationship developed steadily, and they learned together to overcome difficulties related to school, financial issues, and adjusting to adult life, finding compromises and maintaining trust. On July 18, 2015, Alexia and Jonathan were married in Grès-la-Ville, organizing a ceremony with family and friends, after which they settled in a small house in the same town, where they began to build a life together, full of familiar routines and plans for the future. Their marriage was seen by many acquaintances as an example of a harmonious relationship, where both partners supported each other and had common goals and interests. Both were physically active, going jogging together while Alexia continued to work at the bank and Jonathan worked in information technology, combining his job with his hobby of amateur sports. They planned to start a family and have children, which was facilitated by stable jobs, support from their parents, and their own desire to grow their family. Although in the summer of 2017, Alexia suffered a miscarriage, which was a difficult ordeal for the couple. Despite this, their marriage continued to appear stable on the surface. They attended family gatherings together, continued to go jogging and traveling together, maintaining the image of a young married couple that those around them were accustomed to, and no one in their circle of friends suspected that serious conflicts could be brewing in their home. On the morning of October 28, 2017, in Grès-la-Ville, the day began as usual, with the town going about its normal business, when Alexia, aged 29, got ready for her morning run, putting on her sportswear and sneakers, planning to return for breakfast and continue with her weekend activities. According to Jonathan, she left around 9 a.m., choosing one of her usual routes that ran through quiet streets and partly along forest paths leading to the outskirts of the town. Time passed, but Alexia did not return home, and after several hours, around noon, Jonathan reported her disappearance first to her family and then to the police, expressing concern that she was not answering her phone or responding to messages. Throughout the day on October 28, 2017, neighbors and friends who knew Alexia's usual routes joined the search, combing the woods, roads, and country lanes she might have taken. The police recorded the missing person report and sent patrols to search the area, including the Bois de la Vavre forest, which was a few kilometers from the couple's home. The search continued until late in the evening but proved fruitless, causing concern among the Fouillot family and local residents. On the night of October 29, 2017, Jonathan told relatives that he did not know where Alexia was, expressing hope that she would return. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread in the town and anxiety grew as the disappearance of a young woman in a small town caused concern among other residents, especially those who regularly jogged or walked in the area. On the morning of October 29, 2017, the police continued their search, enlisting the help of local volunteers who combed the fields and woods, while Alexia's family distributed flyers with her photo, asking for help from anyone who might have seen her in the early hours of the previous day. Gré-la-Ville, previously known for its peaceful atmosphere, was in a state of alarm, as Alexia's disappearance was an event that disrupted the normal life of the town. No one could have imagined that this story would turn into a case that would change the lives of many people, including the Fouillot family and the community, which would soon learn that something had happened that day that would leave a lasting mark on the town's memory. On the morning of October 3, 2017, in the suburban area of Gré-la-Ville, on the edge of the Bois de la Vavre forest, police sirens sounded when a patrol, together with volunteers who were combing the area, discovered the body of a woman, partially hidden by branches and leaves, in a secluded spot away from the beaten tracks. This spot in the Bois de la Vavre was a dense area of trees that cast shadows even during the day, with damp soil covered in fallen leaves that left marks with every step. With the onset of autumn, this forest, previously used by locals for walks and jogs, filled with the smell of damp earth and decay, and now became a place where police, forensic doctors, and crime lab experts arrived for the first time in many years, when it was determined that the body belonged to Alexia Duval. The authorities notified her family on the same day, and the town of Gré-la-Ville was in shock. Local residents who had recently participated in joint events with the Fouillot family and supported Jonathan Duval now gathered at the entrance to the forest, watching the police work, but unable to even imagine who could have committed this crime. Throughout the day, the area around the site where the body was found was cordoned off with tape, and the police restricted access to the forest to prevent the destruction of evidence that could help establish the circumstances of the incident and identify the possible perpetrator. Investigators began recording every fragment they found, photographing the site, noting the position of the body in relation to the forest trails, and analyzing the traces left on the damp grass and loose soil. Tire tracks were found in the forest, leading to a side road usually used by foresters and local residents to reach the edge of the forest. Experts took casts of the tracks for further analysis in the laboratory. Burnt fragments of fabric were found near the body, some of which were damaged but retained enough structure to allow for examination of the material's origin. Shoe prints were found on the grass near the body, partially deformed due to the damp soil and autumn rains of the previous days. The forensic team worked under time pressure, as with every passing hour there was a risk of losing valuable microparticles that could shed light on the events leading up to Alexia's death. Rumors were spreading quickly through the streets and local shops in Gré-la-Ville, where people discussed what had happened and expressed their fears and concerns. For a small town, the disappearance and death of a young woman, with the killer still unknown, caused anxiety about their own safety and that of their children. People's conversations were filled with concern mixed with confusion, as Alexia was known as a responsible, attentive, and athletic woman who led an active lifestyle and had no known conflicts with those around her. No one could imagine who would want to harm her or why her body was found in the woods, a place that was part of her usual jogging route. Over the next few days, the police presence in the town increased. Additional interviews were conducted with potential witnesses, and police officers went door to door, asking residents if they had seen any suspicious cars or people in the Bois de la Vavre area in the morning or evening of October 28, 2017. The public actively discussed the incident on social media and at residents' meetings, while the authorities asked people to remain calm and report any information that could help the investigation. Jonathan Daval, Alexia's husband, expressed his emotions in public, participated in the search, and appeared alongside the Fouillot family, demonstrating his support and desire to find the perpetrator. For the public, he remained a symbol of a grieving husband who, along with Alexia's parents, was waiting for an answer to the main question on everyone's mind in Gray-la-Ville at the time. Who could have done this to Alexia? The press began to cover the case, publishing articles with photos of Alexia and her family, describing what she was like when she was alive, her passion for running, her work at the bank, and her participation in sporting events. At the same time, journalists emphasized that the investigation had not yet identified any suspects, there were no official theories about possible motives, and the police were continuing their work, analyzing data from surveillance cameras and cell phone towers to reconstruct Alexia's route on the day of her disappearance. At that point, the investigation was focused on establishing the time and circumstances of her last jog, interviewing passers-by and drivers who may have been in the area of the forest in the morning hours of October 28, 2017. After Alexia Daval's body was found in the Bois de la Vavre forest on October 30, 2017, the Haute-Saône Police Department began a systematic and lengthy investigation aimed at reconstructing the chronology of events, comparing data, and collecting physical evidence that could shed light on the circumstances of her death. From the first days of November 2017, experts examined the site where the body was found, marked the possible routes taken, analyzed tire tracks on the damp soil, and collected charred pieces of fabric found in the immediate vicinity of the body. At the same time, forensic experts began studying CCTV footage from cameras installed on the streets of Gray-la-Ville and on access roads to the forest to identify vehicles that had passed through the area where Alexia disappeared. Police officers requested data from mobile operators to analyze phone activity in the forest area during the morning and night hours of October 28, 2017, which allowed them to identify time intervals of activity and absence of signals corresponding to the estimated time of Alexia's disappearance. At the same time, an analysis was carried out on technical devices found in the Daval family home, including a GPS printer that could record movements at specific times, which was a potential source of data for the investigation into Jonathan Daval's movements between the evening of October 27, 2017, and the morning of October 28, 2017. Working with the technical data took several weeks, as experts checked the accuracy of the readings and compared them with other sources of information to rule out possible errors and confirm the reliability of the routes recorded by the system. Throughout November and December 2017, the police continued to interview potential witnesses, including neighbors, local residents, and people who may have been in the forest area or driving nearby at the time Alexia was believed to have gone for a run. Among those interviewed was a neighbor who told the police that he saw a car similar to Jonathan Daval's Peugeot driving down the street toward the forest at night, at a time when Jonathan said he was at home. This fact aroused the interest of the investigation team, but additional confirmation was needed before formal charges could be brought. The witness emphasized that he could not specify the exact time, but based his statement on the fact that he heard the sound of a car at a time when there was usually very little traffic in their neighborhood, as the street leading to the forest was not used for nighttime driving. As part of their examination of the evidence, forensic experts analyzed tire tracks taken at Bois de la Vavre and compared them with those of Jonathan Daval's car. Initial results showed a match in the tread pattern, which was not conclusive evidence, but was a significant detail in the investigation. The investigation understood that such matches could occur with other cars with similar tires, so the focus was on obtaining additional confirmation that would allow them to establish the exact time and route of Jonathan's car on the night before Alexia's disappearance. This data was checked in parallel with the analysis of GPS signals recorded by devices in the car and at home, which revealed inconsistencies with Jonathan Daval's previous explanations regarding his whereabouts at the time of his wife's disappearance. At this time, the Fouillot family continued to support Jonathan Daval, believing that he could not have been involved in Alexia's death. Isabel Fuyo and other family members expressed their support for Jonathan, who actively participated in funeral arrangements, gave interviews to the local press, and attended memorial services for Alexia, appearing calm and grief-stricken to the public in Grey-Laville. Jonathan remained the image of a grieving husband who had lost his wife in tragic circumstances, and none of the residents expressed any open suspicions about him, as there had been no official reports from the investigation indicating that there were grounds for charges. The police, for their part, continued to work within the procedures, keeping the case files confidential, as any premature disclosure of information could have affected the further investigation. Within the investigation team, suspicions gradually arose that the key to solving the case might be linked to Jonathan Daval. But in order to bring formal charges, it was necessary to gather comprehensive evidence that could be presented in court. Police officers carefully compared the time of Alexia's disappearance, Jonathan's statements about the events of that morning, and data from technical devices that could have recorded activity in the family home and possible movements of the car. Throughout December 2017, the police continued to check all incoming information, including reports from the public and new data from laboratories analyzing biological traces found at the scene where the body was discovered. The investigation proceeded cautiously, trying to rule out any errors that could affect subsequent legal proceedings. No formal charges had been brought against Jonathan Daval, and he continued to live his normal life, staying in contact with the Fuyo family and participating in joint events organized in memory of Alexia. Thus, by early January 2018, the investigation had reached a stage where key lines of inquiry had emerged, revealing contradictions between Jonathan Daval's statements and the technical and physical evidence gathered. But the case remained officially open, and no suspect had been named. For the residents of Grey-Laville, this uncertainty was a trial, as the tragedy that had occurred in their town demanded an answer, which they had been waiting for since the morning when Alexia went for a run and did not return home. January 29, 2018, in the Haute-Saône department, was the day that marked a turning point in the Alexia Daval case, changing the course of the investigation and the perception of what had happened by the residents of Grey-Laville and the whole of France. On the morning of that day, Jonathan Daval was invited to the gendarmerie for a second interrogation, during which the investigation team, which had accumulated a significant amount of evidence and factual material by that point, planned to clarify a number of contradictions in his testimony. At that point, the investigation had access to GPS data confirming Jonathan's movements on the night of October 27, 28, 2017. Tire tracks matching his car, information about a blanket found near Alexia's body, and an analysis of microparticles indicating contact with the body after her death. During the first hours of questioning, Jonathan Daval remained calm, confirming his previous statements that on the day of Alexia's disappearance, he had stayed at home and had not left their residence in Grey-Laville. However, as investigators presented the evidence they had gathered, including the results of expert analyses and a timeline, Jonathan began to show signs of nervousness. The investigators presented precise facts, pointing out that the car registered to Jonathan had been spotted near the Bois de la Vavre forest at night, and that tire tracks found at the scene matched those of his vehicle. There were discrepancies between the times Jonathan had previously stated and those recorded by GPS sensors, and the fabric traces found matched the textiles from the Daval family home. Throughout the day, as the questioning continued and details were clarified, Jonathan began to lose confidence in his previous explanations. The pressure of the facts and the methodical work of the investigators, who relied solely on the data collected, allowed Jonathan to be brought out of the state of apparent calm in which he had been during previous interviews. Late in the evening of January 29, 2018, Jonathan Daval confessed that he was involved in the death of Alexia Daval. The confession was recorded and transcribed by police officers, with Jonathan claiming that the events were the result of a conflict that got out of control, and that he did not plan his wife's death, but that what happened became a reality that he tried to get rid of by moving Alexia's body to the forest. After his confession, Jonathan was detained on the same day and the police formally arrested him, allowing the investigation to move into a new phase, focused on detailing the circumstances of the case and preparing materials for transfer to the judicial authorities. The community of Grey-la-Ville was shocked by the news of Jonathan's arrest, as he had previously been actively involved in memorial marches, appeared as grief, appeared on camera, and asked for the perpetrator to be found. For many residents of the town and participants in the White March organized in memory of Alexia, the news that the man who was perceived as having lost his wife was involved in her death came as a shock that caused them to rethink the events of the previous months. The media quickly spread the news of Jonathan Duval's arrest, reporting on the details of the investigation and how the evidence that led to the perpetrator was gradually gathered. The police provided information that there was significant evidence in the case that not only made Jonathan a suspect, but also confirmed his involvement, including GPS data, matching tire tracks, biological evidence, and textile analysis, as well as inconsistencies in statements that emerged when comparing timelines. This information was made available to the public, putting an end to the speculation and rumors that had previously surrounded the case and replacing them with officially confirmed information that demonstrated the effectiveness of the investigation. After his arrest, Jonathan was transferred to a detention center where he remained in custody while investigators continued to gather additional evidence to strengthen the case and clarify all details of the case related to the circumstances of Alexia's death. During this period, investigators analyzed Alexia and Jonathan's correspondence, witness statements, and forensic reports to answer remaining questions about the events of the night before Alexia's disappearance. The public continued to follow developments closely, with discussions and meetings taking place in Grey-la-Ville, where residents expressed their support for the Fouillot family, who were facing a tragedy that was proving to be much more complex and painful than anyone could have imagined in the first days after Alexia's disappearance. At the same time, families and loved ones discussed the need to pay closer attention to safety issues and personal relationships, which, as it turned out, could hide conflicts that were not obvious to those around them. The Haute-Saône departmental investigation authorities, having completed the active phase of the investigation following Jonathan's arrest, began preparing the case for referral to the judicial authorities to ensure an open trial in which all the evidence gathered would be examined, witness and expert testimony heard, and a legal assessment of Jonathan Duval's actions made. This stage of preparation included structuring the evidence, drafting the indictment, and organizing work with the Fouillot family to ensure their participation in the court proceedings and the protection of their interests. The preparation of the case for trial was the final stage of a lengthy investigation that concluded months of work to solve a case that had attracted widespread public attention and was important to everyone who had followed the fate of Alexia Duval. After the active phase of the investigation and the preparation of the case file for trial, the judicial authorities of the Haute-Saône department set a date for the trial of the murder of Alexia Duval, which had attracted the attention of the whole of France. The trial took place in the Vesoul courthouse and began on November 16, 2020, more than 3 years after Alexia failed to return home after her morning jog. From the first days of the trial, journalists, representatives of human rights organizations, and residents of Grey-la-Ville gathered at the courthouse to support the Fouillot family, for whom this trial was a step toward hearing the truth about the events that changed their lives. The trial began with the reading of the indictment, in which the prosecution outlined the circumstances of the case, listing all the evidence gathered, including GPS data analysis, the results of tire track analysis, the match between the fabric found near Alexia's body and items from the Duval family home, and the analysis of microparticles confirming Jonathan Duval's contact with the body after her death. The prosecution noted that for months Jonathan had concealed the truth, creating the appearance of a grieving husband who participated in memorial marches and public statements, while the facts pointed to his involvement in his wife's death. During the hearings, Isabelle Fouillot and other family members testified about Alexia's life, her character, her work, and her plans for the future, emphasizing that she was a determined woman who dreamed of advancing her career and starting a family. In their testimony, they spoke about how they had maintained a relationship with Jonathan until his arrest, believing in his innocence, and how difficult it was for them to learn the truth about his involvement in Alexia's death. These statements evoked deep emotions in the courtroom, creating an atmosphere in which the personal tragedy that had become public due to the circumstances of the case was palpable. Jonathan Daval's lawyers built their defense around the claim that the events were the result of a conflict that escalated into a tragedy with no initial intent to cause harm, emphasizing that Jonathan was under emotional pressure and in a state of stress. However, the prosecution pointed out that Jonathan's actions after Alexia's death, including hiding the body, attempting arson, and participating in memorial events while denying involvement, indicated his deliberate actions to conceal evidence of the crime and mislead investigators and the victim's family. During the trial, forensic experts testified that Alexia's death was caused by strangulation and failure to call for help in a timely manner, allowing the prosecution to argue that Jonathan was responsible for his wife's death. The experts also confirmed that the injuries on the body indicated physical impact that was not accidental, and that the event unfolded in circumstances where Jonathan had the opportunity to stop, but did not do so. The trial lasted 5 days and ended on November 21, 2020, becoming one of the most talked about trials in France at the time. During those 5 days, the court heard more than 20 witnesses, including friends, colleagues, and relatives of Alexia and Jonathan, forensic and medical experts, and confirmed the sequence of events that led to Jonathan's involvement in Alexia's death. Alexia Lavetix, fiancée mariage Lassignac, Alexia Labetu, Le Berrijon. During those days, people gathered outside the courthouse to express their support for the Foula family, leaving flowers and notes with messages of condolence and wishes for justice, creating an atmosphere in which the trial was perceived not only as a legal procedure, but also as an act of collective search for truth. At the end of the hearings, the court retired to deliver its verdict, taking into account the evidence presented, witness statements, expert reports, and Jonathan's confession during the investigation. The court's decision was eagerly awaited by both the Fouillot family and the whole of France, which had been following the case through the media. On November 21, 2020, the Vesoul court found Jonathan Daval guilty of the murder of his wife, Alexia Daval. On November 21, 2020, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Kimberly Karen Mota de Oliveira was born on May 5, 1998 in the small town of Manacor in the state of Amazonas in northern Brazil. It was a town where life flowed slowly and peacefully, surrounded by river channels and tropical greenery. Her family belonged to the middle class. Her father taught history at a school, and her mother worked as a nurse at a local clinic. They raised their daughter strictly but fairly, instilling in her a strong work ethic and a sense of responsibility. Kimberly grew up shy but observant, started reading early, became interested in biology, and even in elementary school confidently said that she wanted to be a doctor. She stood out among her peers in her studies, always prepared, always asking questions with clear goals. Her report card rarely contained comments, but often praise from her teachers. After graduating from high school, she enrolled in the medical school at the Federal University of Amazonas in Manaus, one of the largest cities in the region. To do so, she had to leave her family home, travel hundreds of kilometers, and start adult life in a city where she knew no one. Her parents were proud of her, but they were also worried. Manaus was completely different, noisy, densely populated, with a rhythm that took getting used to. Kimberly rented a small room near the campus and got a job as an assistant at a private clinic. Her studies took up most of her time, but she never complained. On the contrary, she was proud of her choice and took steps to achieve her goal. In 2019, she entered a municipal beauty contest and won. She was crowned Miss Manacor 2019. From that moment on, she became a familiar face at the university, on social media, and at city events, But for Kimberly herself, it wasn't an end in itself, but an opportunity to talk to people, to help, to be heard. Her Instagram was filled with photos of her in a white coat, captions about medicine and responsibility, quotes about compassion and choice. She met Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez in February 2020 at a sports club where she worked out from time to time. He was 31, a fitness trainer with a strong build, a calm manner of speaking, and an outwardly affable demeanor. In the first weeks of their relationship, Kimberly told her friends that he was very attentive and confident. He took an interest in her studies, often asking questions and remembering details. He said he appreciated strong and intelligent women and respected her ambitions. It all started easily. Walks together, cafes, good morning messages. She saw it as a new but not risky beginning. After 2 weeks, they started dating. However, by the end of March, traits began to emerge in his behavior that Kimberly didn't want to notice at first. He became increasingly interested in where she was, who was with her, and why she took so long to respond to messages. He asked for her phone password several times, just so he could trust her. She refused. This was followed by silence, disapproving looks, and reproaches. He began to question her schedule, saying that she was always busy and not paying attention to him. In a message to a friend, she wrote, "He's changed. He controls me all the time as if I'm not a person, but his property." She began to distance herself. In mid-April, Kimberly decided to end the relationship. She didn't want any drama, she just stopped answering his calls. But Rafael didn't give up. He continued to write to her, came to her house, left notes, waited for her at the entrance to the university. In early May, he wrote her a long message, without complaints or demands. He said he realized his mistakes, asked for forgiveness, and begged for one last meeting. "I just want to explain everything. No pressure, just once, please." Kimberly hesitated. Her close friend said she didn't want to go, but she still had doubts. On May 9, she sent a voice message. "He's asking to meet again. He says it will be the last time, that he understands everything. I don't know. Maybe I should just end it." Her friend replied that she should be careful. Kimberly wrote back, "I understand. I'll just talk to him. That's all." On the evening of May 10, she sent her mother a short message. "Mom, I'm at Rafael's today. Everything's fine. Don't worry." This was nothing unusual. They knew who Rafael was and that he had been her boyfriend until recently. Even despite their recent breakup, the family did not feel alarmed. Her mother wished her a good evening and put down her phone. At 7:43 p.m., Kimberly sent her friend a final message. "If I don't get in touch, he's convinced me again. Just kidding, of course. Everything will be fine." Since then, the phone has been silent. On the morning of May 11, her mother tried to contact her daughter. The calls went through, but no one answered. At first, this caused slight concern, but by noon it became clear that something was wrong. Kimberly always let her know if she was going to be late. She never left her phone off. By the evening of May 11, her parents arrived in Manaus and headed to her apartment. The door was locked and there were no lights on inside. Neighbors said they hadn't seen her since the previous day. She didn't show up for class. Her social media accounts remained inactive. Kimberly's mother filed a missing person report. The next day, the police began a search. No one had yet uttered the word crime. Everyone hoped that the girl had simply left, was tired, and had decided to disappear for a day. But with every passing minute, it became clear that she had not disappeared. She was somewhere. No one just knew where. May 11, 2020 began like any other Monday, but for Kimberly's family, it seemed strange from the very first hours. Her mother, having received no messages or answers to her calls in the morning, sensed something that defied logic. For the past 2 years, Kimberly had been living on her own in Manaus and had never left her family without a word. She wrote almost every day, briefly but regularly, how her day had gone, how her studies were going, what she had planned for tomorrow. And now, Not a word. Not a sound. Saturday passed. Sunday passed. And now it was Monday. The phone was not turned off. Calls were coming in, but there was no answer. Closer to noon, her mother dialed again, then again. Then she called Kimberly's friend, the one to whom her daughter had sent her last message the day before. She replied that she hadn't heard anything since morning. Then she tried to text her. Only a single message appeared, as if the phone was on but not receiving data. Her parents didn't wait. On the evening of May 11, they left Manacor and arrived in Manaus late that night. They went straight to Kimberly's apartment. The lights were off. They knocked, waited, talked to neighbors, but there was no sign of their daughter. The door was locked. The house was a typical two-story building with an external entrance and simple metal doors. The neighbors hadn't noticed anything unusual. No screams, no noise, no strangers visiting. Someone recalled seeing her 2 days earlier. That was all. The trail ended there. Her parents filed an official missing person report. The police began gathering information. Their first step was to check her place of residence. The next day, May 12, officers from the Missing Persons Department returned to the address. They knocked on the door, questioned the neighbors again, and contacted the mobile phone operator to track the last signals from her phone. It had been turned off on the night of May 11. There was no data on her movements. Around noon, investigators contacted the building manager and gained access to the archive of CCTV footage from cameras installed at the entrance. Footage from May 10 at around 9:15 p.m. shows Kimberly entering the building with a man. The faces are difficult to make out, but the silhouette of the girl is recognizable. She is wearing a white blouse and dark jeans. The man is wearing a black t-shirt and a cap. After that, there is no footage of Kimberly leaving the building. Only the man, about 2.5 hours later, at 11:40 p.m. leaves alone. This was the first alarming sign. Investigators recorded the video fragment, noted the timestamps, and returned to the door of the apartment where, according to neighbors, the girl had entered. The door was closed, and there were no sounds from inside. With a warrant, police officers broke the lock. Inside it was quiet. The lights were off and the place seemed empty. The apartment had only 2 rooms, a living room combined with a kitchen and a small bedroom. There were no signs of a struggle in the hallway or kitchen area. Everything was in its place. A glass on the sink, a shirt thrown over the back of a chair, a charger in the outlet. But in the bedroom, the scene had changed. The body of a young woman was found near the bed. It was lying partly on the floor and partly on the rug, with its back to the wall. The body had multiple injuries, visually identified as stab wounds. Next to it was a blanket, as if thrown on top in a hurry. Under the bed, wrapped in a kitchen towel, a kitchen knife with a wooden handle was found. There were brown marks on the floor and similar marks on the door handle. Whether the items in the room were not scattered. The window was closed, the curtains drawn. On the bedside table was a medical book, glasses, and next to it a woman's handbag. But there was no phone inside. Investigators carefully examined the scene. They noted that the door had not been broken down, the lock was intact, and there were no signs of forced entry. This suggested that the girl had entered the apartment of her own free will and knew where she was going. A preliminary examination of the body showed that death had most likely occurred on the night of May 10/11. The condition of the body was consistent with this time frame. A knife, a towel, pieces of fabric from the floor, and samples from the door handles were seized. All these items were sent to the forensic laboratory. Fingerprints from the knife and door handle were sent for examination. In addition to the body and the knife, a small gold pendant on a chain was found in the room. It was lying at the edge of the bed, as if it had been torn off. Kimberly's mother later confirmed that it was a birthday present. She wore it almost every day. The police immediately began to establish the identity of the man who had entered the house with her. No name has been released yet. The cameras did not provide clear images, and at this stage, no one has been officially named as a suspect. Investigators worked methodically, reconstructing Kimberly's movements over the past 2 days. It was established that on May 10, she did indeed text her mother that she was on her way to see a friend. Later, her friend showed the correspondence where Kimberly refers to him by name, Raphael. In the messages, she mentions that she is planning a short meeting with no further plans, just for a quiet chat. No traces of other people's presence were found in the apartment. There were no clues indicating a break-in or outside interference. All items were in their places. Detailed data from the camera confirmed that after 11:40 p.m., no one else left the apartment. According to the recording, Raphael left the building alone. At this stage, the investigation was dealing with the fact of death. The crime scene was secured. The cause of death was preliminarily established as multiple injuries. Evidence was collected. The camera footage was partially restored. The name of the man with whom she had entered the apartment had not yet been officially released. The investigation was just beginning. There were many questions. Where was her phone? Why didn't the neighbors hear anything? Why didn't anyone call the police, even though it was late? Who exactly was with her in the apartment during those 2.5 hours, and where did he go? From that moment on, the investigation moved on to the next stage, reconstructing Kimberly's last day and finding out who was with her at that moment. After Kimberly Karen Mota de Oliveira's body was found in an apartment in downtown Manaus, the investigation moved into the next phase. The circumstances of her death were already clear. The girl did not take her own life, and she was not alone in the apartment where she was found. But it was still unclear who was with her that evening and what exactly happened during the 2 hours between her arrival and the moment when the cameras recorded a man leaving the house alone. Most importantly, there were no official charges. A reconstruction of events was needed, based not on guesswork, but on a chain of facts. Investigators started with the basics. Her phone. It wasn't with Kimberly. Her bag was in the bedroom, but her mobile device was gone. The first theory was that someone had taken it to hide information. This wasn't unusual. Smartphones are often where people keep a record of their last few hours. Digital forensics experts requested data from the mobile operator to track the last signal. According to this data, the phone was turned off in the area of Rua Pedro Batista, about 600 meters from the crime scene. This led investigators to believe that the device might have been discarded. The next day, operatives searched trash cans in the area. In one of the bins, wrapped in a bundle of paper towels, they found a smartphone that looked like Kimberly's. It was in working order, but had been reset to factory settings. Nevertheless, forensic experts managed to extract the SIM card and, using special software, recover some of the deleted messages, backups, and chats. From the WhatsApp correspondence, partially restored using cloud data, investigators learned that on the eve of the meeting, Kimberly had written the following to her friend. "He's insisting again. He says he just needs to explain himself. I don't want to, but I'm afraid he'll come over." A few days earlier, she mentioned that she was trying to avoid contact. "I deleted his number. He's threatening to find me at school. I'm tired." These messages did not mention any names directly, but in a conversation with her friend, the phrase, "he says he'll change everything, Raphael just doesn't understand that it's over," appeared. The friend later confirmed that she was talking about Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez. At the same time, investigators analyzed CCTV footage. In addition to the recording from the entrance to the building where she was seen on the evening of May 10, investigators examined other footage from nearby intersections, bus stops, and streets. One of the cameras captured the moment when the same man, presumably Raphael, leaves the building, turns around, and heads toward the main street. A few minutes later, another fragment shows him on the other side of the block. He is not using transportation but walking. This confirmed that he left the apartment without Kimberly late at night and apparently took her phone with him. The next important part of the investigation was interviewing the neighbors. On the first day, immediately after the body was discovered, no one reported any unusual noises or strange sounds. But 2 days later, one of the residents of the building, an elderly man who lived one floor below, contacted the police. He said that on the night of May 12, at around 10:30 p.m., he heard a woman's voice. He did not remember the words, but the tone seemed alarming to him. Another witness, a middle-aged woman who lived next door, gave a more detailed account. She heard a phrase that, according to her, she still cannot forget. "You have no right." It sounded sharp, as if in the heat of an argument. After that, there was silence. She did not call the police that night because she did not hear anything else and decided it was just a normal argument. These details allowed investigators to establish a preliminary timeline. Kimberly entered the building at around 9:15 p.m. According to neighbors, the argument took place at around 10:30 p.m. The man leaves alone at 11:40 p.m. Between these moments, something happened that led to her death. Based on a time analysis, experts made a preliminary conclusion that the actions that led to the tragedy took place between approximately 10:15 p.m. and 11:00 p.m. At the same time, forensic experts analyzed the contents of the apartment. Fingerprints taken from the knife and the inside of the bedroom door handle were sent to the database. A day later, experts confirmed that the fingerprints matched those of Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez, which had already been registered in the database in connection with the processing of documents and passport data. At this stage, despite a wealth of circumstantial evidence, the investigation had not yet brought any formal charges. There was still no direct evidence of intent to cause harm. However, the nature of the evidence, the behavior of the alleged perpetrator, the deleted messages, and the phone found at the scene all pointed to the fact that the meeting that ended in tragedy was not spontaneous. After she left, Rafael did not go to the police or tell his family or neighbors that Kimberly might have left the apartment. He simply disappeared. The disappearance of the person with whom she had last been seen aroused the logical interest of the investigators. Later, a neighbor from the gym was interviewed who recognized Rafael from the description. She confirmed that he had previously exhibited obsessive behavior, was controlling, often asked other girls about their personal lives, and offered help that sometimes seemed inappropriate. All of this painted a picture of a man who wanted to control relationships and was afraid of losing control. The police did not make any premature statements. The suspect's name did not appear in the media or in official comments. But within the investigation team, they understood that the chain of evidence was forming a clear picture. The next step was to find Rafael and question him. Until then, everything remained within the realm of speculation, albeit increasingly well-founded. At this stage, the investigation focused on finding the man who, according to all the evidence, had been with Kimberly on the day of her disappearance. His whereabouts were unknown. Contact with him was lost that same night. His phone was off, and he did not show up at work. There was only one goal left: to find him. 3 days after the tragedy, on May 15, 2020, investigators officially identified the man with whom Kimberly Karen Mota de Oliveira spent her last evening. He was Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez, a 31-year-old resident of Manaus who had previously worked at a fitness center near the university where Kimberly studied. His name had already been mentioned several times in his girlfriend's testimony, and now, with the help of surveillance camera footage, digital evidence, and fingerprints, it became clear that he was the one who accompanied her that evening and then left the house alone 2.5 hours later. By the time the police arrived at his home, Rafael had already disappeared. The apartment where the crime took place belonged to him. He had moved out the day before the investigation team arrived, leaving behind only items of no value. His cell phone was turned off, and his social media accounts had been either deleted or deactivated. According to investigators, all these actions indicated that he was deliberately trying to conceal his whereabouts. Moreover, in the first 24 hours after his disappearance, he withdrew some money from his bank account and then bought a bus ticket to the city of Porto Velho in the neighboring state of Rondônia. Using footage from a camera that recorded his departure from the bus station in Manaus, the police began tracking his movements through regional terminals. However, Rafael, realizing that he might be under surveillance, avoided large transfer hubs and tried to change routes. His final destination, as it later turned out, was the city of Paracatu in the state of Minas Gerais, about 2,000 kilometers from Manaus. He had distant relatives living there, with whom, according to operational data, he hoped to find temporary refuge. On the morning of May 15, at the Paracatu intercity bus station, federal police officers who had received a tip the day before detained a man who identified himself as Mateus Ferreira. He had a fake document with that name on it, as well as a travel backpack containing a change of clothes, an ATM card, a SIM card without an active number, and several handwritten notes with addresses, phone numbers, and routes. He did not resist arrest. After his fingerprints were checked, his identity was confirmed. During his transfer to the police station, Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez initially refused to make a statement. However, after consulting with a lawyer a few hours later, he agreed to undergo preliminary questioning. His first words were, "I just wanted to talk. I didn't want it to end like this." He claimed that the meeting with Kimberly was initiated with the aim of reconciliation, that they talked, argued a little, and then everything got out of control. However, he did not answer the question of why he left the apartment alone and did not inform anyone about her condition. The Amazonas State Prosecutor's Office has formally charged him with a crime punishable by death for intentional homicide. Aggravating circumstances include his close relationship with the victim and his attempt to cover up the crime, including destroying personal data and fleeing the scene. The indictment specifically states that the crime was committed in the context of an interpersonal conflict against a backdrop of control and psychological pressure, which is a typical feature of so-called femicide, a crime in which a woman is killed by a former or current partner. At a press conference held that evening, a police representative stated, "We have confirmation that he accompanied the victim on the last day of her life, was alone with her in the apartment, and that it was after this event that she stopped communicating. The evidence points to his involvement, and his behavior after the incident confirms his intention to avoid responsibility." After his arrest, Rafael was placed in a detention center in Belo Horizonte awaiting transfer back to the state of Amazonas. Local authorities acted quickly. His status was changed to suspect, then to defendant, with formal charges and detention without bail. For the investigation, his capture was a turning point. Now they had not only a bunch of indirect evidence, but also the guy himself, whose behavior backed up the story that he was involved. Even though he had the formal right to a defense and was presumed innocent, the investigation was already shaping up into a logical story. There were weeks left before the trial, but in the public, in the press, and on social media, the name Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez had already become firmly established in people's minds as the name of the man with whom Kimberly had spent her last evening. The trial for the murder of Kimberly Karen Mota de Oliveira began in June 2020 in the Criminal Court of Manaus, the capital of the state of Amazonas. The defendant was Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez, the victim's 31-year-old ex-boyfriend. The prosecution's case was based on a combination of direct and circumstantial evidence gathered during the investigation and was accompanied by intense public and media attention. This was not just a private trial. In the eyes of many, it became a symbol of a broader problem that was increasingly being discussed openly in Brazil. The trial was conducted under the Brazilian Criminal Code, with a judge, prosecutor, defense team, and limited public access. The hearings were held with limited access due to health restrictions imposed in response to the pandemic. Despite this, every day of the trial was covered in local news, and brief excerpts from the statements of lawyers and investigators were widely discussed on social media. The prosecution presented the court with extensive evidence gathered during the investigation. This included surveillance camera footage showing Kimberly and Rafael entering the building on May 10, and Rafael leaving alone 2.5 hours later. Expert reports were presented. His fingerprints found on the knife and other items in the apartment, biological traces, reconstructed messages confirming that Kimberly was afraid of this meeting, data from a phone found, reset, and discarded near the scene of the crime. The forensic psychiatric report attracted particular attention. Rafael underwent a full diagnostic evaluation as part of the investigation, and experts concluded that at the time of the incident, he was of sound mind, aware of his actions, and did not suffer from any mental disorders. He understood what he was doing and consciously tried to cover his tracks. This detail became key in the prosecutor's counter-argument to the defense's claim of temporary loss of control. Rafael's lawyers tried to portray the crime as a tragedy committed in the heat of the moment, against a backdrop of emotional stress caused by a final breakup. They emphasized that the meeting was allegedly prearranged and that Rafael did not plan to cause harm. However, the court did not accept this line of defense, stating that the defendant's actions after the incident, deleting data, fleeing using fake documents, indicated an intention to avoid responsibility, rather than a sudden emotional breakdown. Several witnesses testified during the trial. Kimberly's friend, with whom she had been corresponding on the eve of the meeting, neighbors who heard the argument that night, and police officers involved in the investigation. The judge also heard from representatives of the digital forensics lab, who confirmed that the messages and data retrieved from the phone had been properly restored and were authentic. In his closing statement, the prosecutor said, "This girl did not die by accident. She died at the hands of a man she once trusted. He robbed her of her future and then tried to rob her of her voice by destroying everything that could tell the story of her last hours." Rafael himself behaved reservedly in court, avoiding direct eye contact with the victim's family. When asked by the judge if he admitted his guilt, he replied evasively, "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't think," and fell silent. His defense insisted on his right not to give detailed testimony. On September 17, 2020, the Court of First Instance in Manaus found Rafael Fernandez Rodriguez guilty of intentional murder with aggravating circumstances. On September 21, 2020, he was sentenced to 29 years in a maximum security prison. Ildiko Kradniak was born on August 14, 1969, in Szeged, a city in southern Hungary near the border with Serbia. Her family was intelligent and modest. Her father taught mathematics at a technical college, and her mother worked as a nurse. Her parents instilled in their daughter a strong work ethic, respect for knowledge, and a desire for independence. From childhood, Ildiko was distinguished by her diligence, interest in the natural sciences, and dreaminess, which she expressed through drawing, cosmetics, and language study. At school, she was known as the Little Diplomat for her gentle nature, careful choice of words, and ability to resolve conflicts between her peers. By the time she finished high school, she was already fluent in English and wanted to pursue a career in aesthetics and body care. Inspired by her mother's stories about medicine and the human body, she enrolled in a local medical school, specializing in physical therapy and dermatological cosmetology. In the early 1990s, after the fall of socialism, Ildiko moved to the United States on an education and employment visa. She first settled in Chicago, but after a few years moved to California, seeking a warmer climate and opportunities in the beauty industry. There, she obtained her cosmetology license, began working in salons, and eventually gained a reputation as a specialist with a feel for skin. By the mid-2000s, she had an established clientele, a portfolio that included treatments for celebrities and recognition among her peers. In 2012, she opened her own salon in Aliso Viejo, a small office on the first floor of an office building where women came every day for care, relaxation, and confidential conversation. Ildiko created an atmosphere of care and comfort around her. Clients often called her a psychologist with a mask in her hands. She knew how to listen, remember details, and offer support. Stephen Beale came into her life in the mid-2010s. He was a few years older, charismatic, intelligent, and interested in engineering projects, model rockets, and pyrotechnics. They met at a charity event held at a local art gallery. Stephen, who had been widowed in 2008, seemed charming and attentive. Ildiko was attracted by his neatness, his ability to speak to the point, and his interest in culture. Their relationship developed slowly but steadily. He helped her with interior repairs, accompanied her on trips, and showed her his model engine assembly projects. She supported him when he was undergoing treatment for the effects of chemicals used in his hobby. But over the years, according to friends, friction began to arise in their relationship. Jealousy, control, and differences in outlook. Ildiko became more independent, planning trips without him and discussing expanding the business. Despite the complexity of their relationship, their union lasted several years. They were not officially married, but they lived as a couple. And according to acquaintances, Stephen was emotionally dependent on her, although outwardly everything looked quite respectable. May 15, 2018 was no different from any other day. The morning was sunny. Ildiko arrived at the salon a little earlier than usual, parked her white Audi, walked through the glass doors and, as always, turned on the lights and the music player. The first clients began to arrive around 11 o'clock. The procedures went on as usual. That same morning, she received a small package. According to eyewitnesses, the box was unremarkable, neutral in color with no bright markings addressed to her personally. She brought it to her office, placed it on the table, and apparently decided to open it during a short break between appointments. At 1:00 p.m., when two other clients were still in the room, there was a loud bang. The building shook from the explosion. The walls shook and glass flew everywhere. In a matter of seconds, the room was filled with dust and smoke. Neighboring offices were evacuated. Firefighters, police, and paramedics arrived at the scene. The area was cordoned off. A woman at the entrance described what happened as an explosion that rang in my ears. Two victims were rushed to the hospital. Ildiko Krajniak, who was closest to the source of the explosion, died at the scene. Initially, it was assumed that the cause could have been a domestic accident, faulty equipment, a gas cylinder, or a short circuit. But the nature of the destruction, the smell in the air, and the characteristics of the damage suggested otherwise. This was no accident. Someone had sent an explosive device, and while the streets of Aliso Viejo were still ringing with sirens, work began in the corridors of federal agencies, cautious, methodical, and long. The investigation was just beginning. On that May day, nothing foreshadowed disaster. Until lunchtime, Ildiko Krajniak's salon was operating as usual. Pleasant music, the smell of eucalyptus, appointments for treatments, clients coming in for hair care, massages, and confidential conversations. The office was cozy and well kept, reflecting the character of its owner, precise, calm, and confident. But all that disappeared in an instant when, around 1 p.m., the room shook from a loud bang. The explosion disrupted not only the silence, but also the very fabric of everyday life. Plaster flew off the walls, shards of glass rained down from the display cases, and alarms screeched inside. In a matter of seconds, the salon was filled with smoke and dust. People from neighboring offices rushed out into the street. 5 minutes later, Marableu Street was already blocked off. First ambulances arrived, then the police and firefighters. There were 3 victims. 2 women survived with injuries of varying severity. The owner of the salon, Ildiko, who was closest to the source of the explosion, died at the scene. Initially, the accident was thought to be accidental, possibly faulty equipment, overheated oil, or a short circuit. However, as experts arrived, it became clear that the destruction was deliberate. Firefighters inspected the interior and found that the explosion did not come from outside. It occurred inside, near a table where a small box was standing. The plastic was torn apart, parts of the case were scattered within a radius of several meters, and burn marks were visible on the ceiling in some places. This indicated that a component with a high combustion temperature had been used. 2 hours after the incident, representatives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, joined the investigation. Even then, suspicion began to fall on internal rather than external causes. The processing of the scene began. Forensic experts used tongs, brushes, and special analyzers to ensure that no fragment was overlooked. Numerous metal parts were found on the floor, some of them partially burned and melted. One of the clients who was able to give a brief statement mentioned that shortly before the explosion, Ildiko had brought a package to the office, an ordinary cardboard box probably received through the postal service. She did not have the slightest suspicion, neither about its weight, appearance, nor smell, and yet it was this box that became the source of the tragedy. Fragments of the packaging found in different parts of the room underwent initial analysis. Traces of glue, metal particles, sharp elements, something like bearings or balls were found on the inside of the box. Experts later confirmed that the device was homemade, designed and assembled by hand. It included a lithium battery power supply, a detonation circuit, probably via a contact detonator, and striking elements typical of unauthorized pyrotechnics. A rare component was used as an explosive, leaving bright orange traces on the nearest walls and furniture. Chemical analysis revealed a substance that is not used for domestic purposes, but is found in incendiary mixtures and rocket propellants. This discovery proved to be crucial. This chemical is not sold in regular stores. It is difficult to obtain without specific knowledge or connections. This substance is typically used by people involved in technical modeling, fireworks, or industrial pyrotechnics. This feature instantly narrowed down the circle of suspects. It was not just a question of who might have wanted to cause harm, but who had the technical ability to assemble such a device. In addition, everything pointed to the fact that the perpetrator knew that Ildiko would be there at that exact moment. The package was not sent to her home address or at a random time. It was timed for a workday when she would be there in person. This meant one thing. Someone knew her schedule, habits, and routine. Investigators questioned the Postal Service employees who served the building to determine how exactly the package had arrived and at what stage it could have been replaced or planted. CCTV footage was seized. It was established that the box had been delivered by a courier service at around 10:45 a.m. and left at the reception desk of the office complex. According to the administrator, it was indeed signed for by Ildiko, with no indication of the sender, just her name and office number. This was another important detail. The perpetrator took care not to attract attention with either the packaging or the delivery method. Meanwhile, ATF laboratories and FBI experts were reconstructing the device. The assembled components indicated a high level of preparation. For example, the wire connections were neatly made using epoxy resin and heat-shrink tubing. The batteries were reliable with a good service life. This suggested that the device was not designed to detonate spontaneously, but to be triggered at a specific time. Forensic experts recreated the bomb's outline on a 3D model and concluded that it was activated when the lid was opened, causing a short circuit through the built-in circuit board. This meant that whoever sent the package expected it to be opened by the addressee. A piece of paper with a partial fingerprint was also found. It was sent to a federal database for identification. There were no results yet, but the fact that there was a fingerprint strengthened the investigators' position. The device had been assembled by hand, and this could have been a trace from one of the stages of manufacture. Meanwhile, research was being conducted on the substance. The orange powder. Chemists confirmed that the compound was unstable, dangerous when heated, and required protective equipment and expertise. Its use outside of a manufacturing environment was virtually impossible without specialized training. At this stage, investigators already understood that the perpetrator was not only technically skilled, but also had access to information about the victim. It could not have been a coincidence that the explosive device arrived on the day when Ildiko was working without an assistant. She usually had fewer clients on Tuesdays and sometimes remained alone in the office. The investigation checked internal connections, former employees, partners, clients, acquaintances. A list of people who had access to her schedule began to take shape. Investigators also noticed the absence of cameras in the office itself. This complicated the task. However, external cameras captured something interesting. Several days before the incident, a dark-colored SUV appeared repeatedly in the area near the office, stopping in the parking lot closer to the building. Its license plate number was partially deciphered. A check of the databases showed a match with a car registered to a man who had previously been in a relationship with Ildiko. At that point, it was just a thread, but an important one. The pieces gathered, the device, the rare materials, the precision of the execution, the knowledge of the schedule, all pointed to a carefully planned crime. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision or an emotional outburst. It was calculated. That is why the investigation could not afford to rush. Every step had to be checked, every piece of evidence confirmed from different angles. The question was not only who did it, but also why. The investigation that followed the explosion became one of the most complex and sensitive operations in Orange County in recent years. In the days following the tragedy, investigators focused on reconstructing the chain of events, analyzing evidence, and studying the victim's lifestyle. As these pieces began to fit together, a man emerged from the background, whose name was mentioned more and more often in conversations with Ildiko's friends and family, but who, at first, was not considered a suspect in the crime. He was Ildiko's former partner, a man with whom she had more than just a relationship. Their relationship had lasted several years. They traveled together, attended events, and made plans for the future, but, according to her friends, it ended badly. The breakup occurred a few months before the tragedy and, according to some of her friends, was accompanied by emotional scenes, unspoken words, and moments of anxiety. Ildiko could not stand conflict, but in recent months she had reportedly been feeling increasing pressure from whom no one specified at the time. When investigators began analyzing her digital devices, her phone, laptop, and cloud services, they found messages and notes in which she mentioned tense conversations with her former partner, concerns about his excessive interest in her movements, the appearance of unsigned messages, and even a feeling of being followed. Although she never reported the threats officially, the tone of her notes, especially those made in March and April, gave investigators the strong impression that Ildiko was feeling psychological pressure but did not want to involve the police. This information was not conclusive, but it did provide a lead. It revealed a name that had not previously been linked to the incident. It was then that investigators turned their attention to surveillance camera footage from the office building where the salon was located. Several days before the tragedy, on May 9, 10, and 11, a car matching Stephen Beal's description was spotted near the entrance to the building. The camera captured an SUV parked where Ildiko's Audi usually stood. Neither the driver nor the passengers were clearly visible in the recording, but analysis of the license plate, even partially illuminated, identified it as belonging to Stephen. This fact became the first material lead. Unconfirmed but significant. Was he in the car? Why was he at her office? Was it a coincidence? The police requested a warrant for temporary access to his GPS navigation data and, within the limits of the law, for information from his phone and laptop. Once they got the go-ahead, investigators took Stephen Beal's electronic devices for analysis. At the same time, on May 18, his house in Long Beach was searched. FBI, ATF, and local police were involved. They started with his workshop and garage. Inside the rooms used to assemble model rockets, the investigation was already aware of his hobby. Chemicals, plastic containers, diagrams, and electrical circuit parts were found. At first glance, nothing illegal. Everything could be explained by his hobby. He was indeed involved in building model engines, participated in exhibitions, and communicated on technical forums. However, according to ATF experts, some of the materials found in his storage room matched the composition of those used in the homemade device that exploded in the cabin. For example, a small plastic container was seized, the inside of which had traces of the same orange substance. Rolls of wiring were also found that matched the color, thickness, and type of insulation found at the scene. A sealed bottle marked, "For experiments, do not touch," was found in the chemical storage box, in which experts later identified peroxide compounds suitable for creating unstable mixtures. However, all this remained circumstantial. None of the substances were illegal in themselves. None of the items contained any obvious signs linking them to a specific parcel. There were no fingerprints on the bomb, nor was there any direct evidence that he had sent the box. But the combination of these factors, the chemical components, the technical knowledge, the personal proximity to the victim, the confirmed presence at her office a few days before the incident, and the messages with alarming hints, began to form a coherent picture. A psychologist brought in to assist with the investigation described the possible profile of the perpetrator as technically competent, rational, but emotionally unstable and prone to control. This portrait matched the traits described by Ildiko's friends when talking about her former partner. Meanwhile, the lab kept analyzing the clues found in the wreckage. One of the experts noticed how the wires were connected in the device, an unusual use of a thin layer of epoxy resin and specific clips to hold the joints together. This technique was rare and not typical for most homemade devices. When photographs of the samples from Beale's home were compared with elements of the bomb's design, several similarities were found in the assembly method, including a characteristic mark left by the soldering tool used. In addition, experts found rough sketches on Beale's tablet, presumably made several weeks before the incident. One of them showed a model of a box-shaped device with a detonator, labeled Prototype Do Not Activate, Test. It was not identical to the bomb's design, but it used the same principles: a cover, a contact switch, a battery, and a switch. All this still did not allow for an indictment. However, internal reports from the investigation team already indicated that Stephen Beale was a key figure of interest. Investigators did not name him as a suspect, arrest him, or question him with a view to pressing charges. But his name was everywhere, in the file, in the chains of analysis, in the team's brainstorming sessions. It was during this period, about a week after the tragedy, that investigators began to realize that more than coincidences were needed to obtain full confirmation of his involvement. They needed certainty, which could be provided by either a fingerprint, a digital trace, or a confession. The work was just beginning, and new units were joining the investigation. Ahead lay painstaking work on the details, matching dates, routes, chemistry, psychology, and most importantly, finding the link that would tie everything together into an unbreakable chain. The investigation had reached the point where there was no longer any doubt. Everything that had previously seemed like a series of coincidences, the chemicals in the house, the old diagrams, the strange routes, now had a precise, scientifically proven explanation. Laboratory analysis showed that the composition of the lead compound found at the scene of the explosion was identical to the substance stored in Stephen Beale's workshop. The samples were compared on dozens of parameters, from the level of purification and molecular structure to micro traces characteristic of a specific production batch. Moreover, the identity of the micro-impurities in both substances allowed investigators to conclude that these were not just similar compounds, but material from the same source. Such a result could not be explained by chance. At this stage, investigators delved deeper into the digital trail. Several technical files were extracted from Stephen's laptop. Among them were diagrams and drawings of devices that included timers, contact detonators, battery packs, and mechanical pressure activation elements. One of the documents, created several weeks before the tragedy, was a drawing that used the same components found at the scene: a plastic case, batteries, a connecting board, and a switch that activated when the cover was lifted. Formally, this could have been just an engineering sketch, but in essence it practically replicated the structure of the real device that went off in the cabin. Purchase data provided additional confirmation. Through financial documents, investigators discovered 2 orders placed by Stephen Bill on a specialized website of a pyrotechnics company in Virginia. The order was placed in April, a month before the explosion. The invoice listed orange substance 500 grams, technical cleaning. The delivery address matched the address of his workshop. Stephen used his name and corporate email address, registered during his consulting days, to place the order. This was not just an indirect hint, but a concrete document proving that he had access to the material used in the device. However, the most significant find was a fingerprint. One of the burnt fragments of the inner packaging delivered to the FBI laboratory contained a partially preserved fingerprint. It took several days to reconstruct it. Using chemical treatment, digital modeling, and layering, the fingerprint structure was restored. After checking the federal database, it became clear that the fingerprint belonged to Stephen Beale. It had been taken earlier, in 2011, when he registered as a participant in an engineering festival related to experimental technology. This coincidence became a critical element. Now the investigation had not only a motive, not only the technical capability, not only a personal connection to the victim, but also physical evidence linked to the crime scene. On May 24, 2018, at 6:40 a.m., ATF agents and county police officers arrived at a house on a quiet street in Long Beach. Stephen Beale was at home. The arrest went smoothly, without resistance. He was informed that he was being detained on suspicion of possessing explosives without the proper permits. This was a legally valid basis for holding him in custody until all procedures were completed. At the time of his arrest, he had not yet been charged with murder, but investigators already knew that it was only a matter of time. In the days that followed, the prosecutor's office, together with federal agencies, completed the indictment. The charges included several counts: intentional use of an explosive device resulting in death, attempted harm to others, and illegal possession of components of an explosive device. Everything that had previously been part of a hypothesis was now official. Every piece of evidence, chemical, digital, documentary, and fingerprint, corroborated the version that investigators had been pursuing from day one. The explosion in the car was not an accident, but the result of a precise, cold-blooded calculation by someone who knew the victim, her routine, her lifestyle, and her character. Now, Bill was no longer just Ildiko's former partner. He was the accused, and he was facing trial. The trial for the explosion in Ildiko Kraniak's salon became one of the most high-profile cases in Orange County in recent years. The case was heard in the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California in Santa Ana. The defendant was Stephen Beale, 64, a former engineer with no previous criminal record, who was into technical modeling and had been in a close relationship with the victim. The indictment was based on 4 main counts: attempted use of an explosive device resulting in death, attempted harm to others, unlawful possession of explosives, and use of a weapon of mass destruction. The hearings began in mid-2022. The trial itself lasted more than 2 years, with several breaks due to the complexity of the case, the large volume of evidence, and the need for additional technical expertise. The court hearings were accompanied by strict security measures. Representatives of federal agencies, witnesses, experts, and relatives of the victim and the defendant were present. The media, in turn, followed every stage, but most of the details, especially those concerning the nature of the device and its chemical composition, were not disclosed in full given their sensitivity. The prosecution relied on a comprehensive body of evidence, including physical evidence, digital traces, eyewitness testimony, and laboratory test results. The following points were key: the identity of the chemicals found on the defendant and at the crime scene, documents confirming the purchase of rare pyrotechnic components, electronic drawings of devices corresponding to the design of the explosion, a fingerprint on the inside of the packaging, and video footage showing Stephen's car near Ildiko's office a few days before the tragedy. The court paid particular attention to the psychological aspects of the case. Witnesses were heard, Ildiko's friends and colleagues, as well as members of her family, who reported that in the last months of her life she had been experiencing stress and tension related to her former partner. Excerpts from her personal correspondence were read out, in which she mentioned feeling watched and under emotional pressure. Although there were no direct threats in the messages, the context of the communication and the tone of the letters indicated an unstable dynamic between her and Stephen after their breakup. The defense, in turn, insisted that there was no direct intent. The lawyers argued that the technical materials found in Stephen's home were part of his hobby, and the presence of rare chemicals and diagrams did not prove his guilt. The defense emphasized that their client was a man immersed in technical experiments, passionate about engineering, and had never shown any tendency toward aggression. According to their version, the fingerprint could have gotten on the packaging accidentally while the materials were being stored. However, under the weight of systematically constructed evidence, this version gradually lost strength. The prosecution presented a complete chronological analysis, from the moment the chemicals were purchased to the shipment of the package, the route it took, the time it arrived at the office, and the moment it was opened. A comprehensive reconstruction showed that the device could not have been assembled without a precise understanding of the mechanics and knowledge of how and when the victim would come into contact with the parcel. Experts confirmed that the short circuit occurred when the lid was lifted, a detail requiring precision, and it was precisely this diagram that was found on the defendant's computer. The court heard more than 20 witnesses, including explosives experts, technical consultants, forensic scientists, and postal and courier service employees. Each testimony reinforced the main line of the prosecution. The crime was planned, carried out by a person with technical skills, and directed specifically at one victim. The sentencing hearing took place in January 2025. District Court Judge Josephine Staton delivered the closing remarks. In her speech, she emphasized that the evidence presented by the prosecution formed a continuous chain with no links of chance. She noted that the crime was calculated and deliberate, and that its consequences were devastating not only for the victim, but also for everyone who happened to be nearby. On January 19, 2025, the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California found Stephen Beal guilty of intentionally using an explosive device, resulting in death, attempted murder, and unlawful possession of components classified as weapons of mass destruction. On January 23, 2025, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and an additional 30 years for the charges he faced. Jamie Hahn was born in 1982 in the small town of Chocovini in rural eastern North Carolina, into a family that valued hard work and respect for others. Her parents, Bill and Margaret Kirk, were modestly well off but had strong moral values. Her father ran an insurance agency and her mother taught elementary school. They believed that good deeds start with personal example and tried to instill this in their only daughter. From an early age, Jamie stood out among her peers. Her teachers described her as a sharp-minded child with a strong sense of justice. During her school years, she participated in local debates, wrote articles for the county newspaper, and organized charity fairs. As a teenager, she already said that one day she would change politics from the inside. This was not youthful bravado. Jamie knew exactly what she wanted. After high school, she enrolled at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, majoring in political science. There, she distinguished herself as one of the most active students in her class. Her name became well known in student circles thanks to her participation in charitable initiatives, election campaigns, and debate clubs. She often took on the role of coordinator in volunteer groups and spoke at panel discussions. She was respected for both her tact and her determination. During the 2004 presidential campaign, Jamie was already working on the campaign staff of one of the candidates in North Carolina. There she first met Nation Hahn, a student and volunteer who was as passionate about politics as she was. At the time, they were just campaign colleagues. Jamie was a senior, experienced coordinator and Nation was a junior, ambitious assistant. Their interaction was limited to work discussions and brief conversations between rallies. Several years later, when both had other relationships and more professional experience under their belts, they happened to cross paths at a seminar on electoral reform. Nation, who had since graduated from college, was working at an educational policy think tank, while Jamie was heading up the consulting firm Sky Blue Strategies. What began as an exchange of ideas quickly grew into something more. They were united not only by their political views, but also by their outlook on life. The values they lived by were almost identical. In 2009, they got married. The wedding was attended by a small circle of friends and family. Nation wrote his own vows, and Jamie wrote a speech that, according to the guests, made even the waiter cry. Among the guests was Jonathan Broyhill, a friend of Nation's since childhood, with whom he grew up and attended the same church. He was the best man at the wedding and later became a regular guest at the Han family home. Jamie and Nation's family life was filled with working together, projects, and endless discussions of new ideas. They didn't just share a life, they shared a purpose. Their home became an informal headquarters where activists would meet in the evenings to discuss campaign strategy and share news. The place was alive. Coffee was brewing in the kitchen, and sticky notes with reminders to call the congressman or check the bills were pinned to the board. Everything here was permeated with movement. Jonathan Broyhill became practically a member of the family during this period. Jamie invited him to work with her at Sky Blue Strategies, handling financial reporting for one of the campaigns. He often came in with his laptop and dinner to go, put a stack of papers on the table, and discussed business. Sometimes he stayed late to help check the spreadsheets. Sometimes he brought ice cream and put on old movies. He didn't seem intrusive. On the contrary, he was calm, delicate, and reserved. No one would have guessed that this outward composure hid an inner tension. By 2013, the couple was preparing for another important stage in their lives. Jamie was campaigning for one of the candidates for regional office, and Nation was developing an initiative related to young leaders. There was a lot of work to do, and the house once again became the center of all their efforts. In the spring, they decided to conduct an internal audit of all their old contracts for any accidental inaccuracy. It was at this point that Jonathan offered his help, voluntarily, without being asked. Monday, April 22, 2013 began quietly. Jamie spent the morning in downtown Raleigh, in meetings, discussions, and on the phone. Nation worked from the charities office. In the afternoon, they exchanged messages. "Let's have dinner at home tonight. John is coming over to help with the paperwork." At 6:40 p.m., a familiar sedan pulled up to the house on Treetop Court. Jonathan got out with a folder under his arm as usual. It was a familiar ritual. He and Jamie often went through reports in the evenings when there were no outside distractions. Inside, the atmosphere was businesslike. Jamie opened her laptop to check the spreadsheets, and Nation went to the kitchen to make tea. In the living room, they discussed old payments and checked the amounts. Everything looked like any other evening. Three people who had known each other for many years doing their usual work together. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about this story. The North Raleigh neighborhood was quiet and green, living at its usual pace. Dogs were being walked, lawns were neatly mowed, and it was a warm April evening. For Jamie Hahn and Nation Hahn, it was supposed to be another ordinary evening. Dinner, a little work, and maybe a couple of episodes of their favorite TV show before bed. But an hour after Jonathan Broyhill arrived, something changed. Neighbors heard muffled sounds. First, a short scream, then a loud thud, as if something had fallen. The living room window was ajar, and a woman's voice could be heard coming from the Winstons' house. At 8:17 p.m., Sandra Winston dialed 911 and reported that she could hear screams. Something was happening in the house across the street. It was very disturbing. Someone was calling for help. 9 minutes later, a patrol car arrived at the scene. The door was unlocked. The police entered and saw Nation Hahn in the hallway. He was injured but conscious. Further inside, closer to the dining room, Jamie Hahn was lying on the floor in critical condition. Jonathan Broyhill was in the room. He was sitting on the floor with his head in his hands. He did not say a word. He did not respond to questions. An ambulance took the couple to the hospital. The police seized items at the scene and took Jonathan away for questioning. The official report stated, "Serious incident in a residential building. Investigation ongoing." So far, no suspects had been identified. The night in North Raleigh began as usual. The yards were plunged into darkness, the houses had their blinds closed, and the streetlights illuminated the asphalt with a soft yellow light. It was a little after 8 when sirens were heard on Treetop Court. Several cars with their lights flashing stopped outside a two-story brick house with white shutters. Police officers poured out of their patrol cars, professional, collected, but visibly tense. The call had been logged as a possible assault in a residential area with victims. The officers did not expect any particular threat, but standard procedure required caution. They approached the front door, which was unlocked. Inside, it was quiet. A man was lying on the floor in the hallway, wearing a shirt and with a bloody hand. He was conscious and whispered something as he looked at the officer who approached him. It was Nation Han. One of the patrol officers immediately called for medical assistance while the other entered the dining room. There on the floor at the edge of the dining table, Jamie Han lay motionless. Next to her was a dark stain on the parquet floor, a broken chair, and scattered papers. The room was filled with a sharp smell, a mixture of blood, hot plastic from the laptop which had been working just a moment ago, and something else that was difficult to identify. Panic. Against the wall, in the shadows, sat a third person, a man in his 30s. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. It was Jonathan Broyhill. He showed no resistance, made no attempt to escape, and did not utter a word. His hands were free but trembling slightly. The police approached calmly without rushing and led him to a patrol car, first making sure he was unarmed. He did not resist. The first officers to arrive at the scene did not jump to conclusions. It was decided to immediately block access to the house and call in the investigative team on duty. 40 minutes later, two plainclothes officers arrived at Treetop Court. Detective Justin Hill and Lieutenant Carla Mason, representatives of the Raleigh Police Department's Major Crimes Unit. Hill, a short, stocky detective with 20 years of experience, was the first to enter the house. He didn't ask any unnecessary questions. He carefully examined the hallway, then the living room, where the computer was on the table, and then the dining room. Every step was methodical. Meanwhile, Carla Mason talked to the patrol officers, checking their reports and making sure that any potential evidence was secure. The room was messy but not chaotic. It was obvious that there had been a struggle between the people in the house. Several papers lay on the floor, reports, printed tables, political notes. A document titled Q1 Campaign Reconciliation Etheridge was open on the laptop screen. A knife lay on the kitchen counter next to the sink. It was from a set that had been standing on the counter. Traces on the floor, dried drops, fingerprints. Everything was recorded in accordance with procedure. Forensic photographers began their work almost immediately, using white-numbered signs and placing them throughout the incident area. The crime scene was filled with the quiet clicks of camera shutters. The ambulance that arrived after the police worked in a coordinated manner. Jamie Han was immediately placed on a stretcher. Her condition was listed as critical. Deep wounds to her abdomen and shoulder, signs of significant blood loss. Nation Han was in more stable condition but also suffered serious injuries, presumably from the collision or struggle. Both were taken to WakeMed, the largest medical facility in Wake County. Paramedics attempted to stabilize Jamie en route using mobile equipment, inserting a catheter and starting an IV. Nation was conscious and able to give his name but did not respond to questions. This fact would later play a role in piecing together the timeline of events. While work continued at the house, officers began interviewing neighbors. The first were Sandra and Tom Winston, an elderly couple who lived across the street. It was Sandra who called the police. According to her, at around 8:10 p.m., she heard a scream and then what sounded like someone calling for help. A few seconds later, she heard a man's voice. There was panic. It was unexpected. At first, I thought something had fallen, but then it became clear that it was serious. The neighbor on the right, Holly Chen, noted that at around 6:45 p.m., she saw a car parked outside the Han home. She recognized the car as belonging to Jonathan Broyhill, whom she knew from previous visits. He was there often, especially in the evenings. Everything looked normal, she said. The guest's behavior did not arouse any suspicion. The police also checked street surveillance cameras installed at the corner of the block. The footage shows a silver sedan pulling into the street at 6:42 p.m. and stopping near the Han home. There was no further movement. The cameras did not record anyone else entering or leaving the house. This confirmed that only 3 people were in the house at the time of the incident. Detectives decided to seize the laptop, tablet, and both mobile phones found in the house. These devices were sealed and sent to the police department's laboratory for further analysis. The documents opened on the laptop attracted the most attention. Spreadsheets, reports, and letters dated several days before the incident. An unsent draft letter was also found, saved in a local folder. Financial review pending, immediate attention. The recipient's name did not appear in the draft, but the content suggested possible accounting irregularities. At that point, this did not raise any specific suspicions, but it was noted as an item for further investigation. No charges have been filed yet. The crime has been classified as aggravated assault with unknown motive. The investigation was just getting started. The morning of April 23, 2013, started with a quiet alarm at WakeMed Hospital. While doctors continued to fight for Jamie Han's life, police officers working at the scene began to piece together the first logical links in the chain of investigation. Nation Han, who was in stable but weakened condition, was briefly questioned in the presence of doctors. Detective Justin Hill entered the room early in the morning. Nation was sitting upright with a bandage on his chest and an oxygen mask nearby. He spoke with difficulty but tried to be as precise as possible. When Hill asked him about the events of the previous evening, Nation replied simply, "It happened suddenly. We were working. Jamie was discussing something. I was in the kitchen. Then, it all happened in seconds. I heard a scream. I don't remember much else." When the detective asked a follow-up question about whether he could identify the attacker, Nation shook his head slightly. "I'm not sure. It's all too foggy. I'm sorry." The doctors interrupted the conversation, citing the patient's physical and emotional exhaustion. Officially, the testimony was recorded as incomplete, with no mention of a third person in the house. The police had no grounds to make specific charges yet, only facts. There were 3 people in the house, 2 in the hospital, and 1 detained for questioning. Realizing that the key to the motive might lie not only in the events of the evening, but also in the preceding context, investigators decided to focus on Jamie's work. Through Sky Blue Strategies, she ran the campaign of former Congressman Bob Etheridge. And it was through this connection that Jonathan Broyhill came to the house. His involvement in the financial management of campaigns had been documented since 2010. He had access to all payment documents, reports, and accounting records. Jamie's laptop, which had been seized the day before, contained a number of open files, among which tables with the headings Reconciliation Q1 and notes Double Check, Discrepancy, and JB attracted particular attention. These documents mentioned transactions made on behalf of various individuals, but they were linked to recurring addresses that matched Broyhill's registration. Some amounts were of particular interest: $2,800.00, $3,500.00, and $5,200.00, all listed under external contractors. At the same time, Jamie mentioned unexplained debits in her comments. Detective Carla Mason instructed a police financial analyst to conduct an urgent reconciliation with the banks that served Etheridge's campaign. At the same time, conversations began with Sky Blue Strategies employees. The first to be interviewed was Emily Harris, Jamie's assistant. She described Jonathan as calm, a little withdrawn, but hardworking. However, she said that his behavior had changed in recent months. He had become more prone to outbursts, forgetting basic details, coming to work without his laptop, and asking colleagues to send him documents that he previously had direct access to. He complained about his health several times, mentioning that his cancer had returned. Emily did not ask any questions, taking his word for it. Her testimony coincided with what Justin Craig, another agency employee, later said. He also heard Jonathan mention his illness. He said once that his time was limited. We all thought it was related to his treatment. He said he didn't want anyone to know. The investigation team sent requests to regional cancer centers and large private clinics in North Carolina. The response was the same. No patient with that name was listed in their records. This aroused serious interest in the investigation. Too many people had heard about Jonathan's alleged illness, but no one had seen a single document. Moreover, a search of his apartment turned up no prescriptions, appointments, or packaging for specialized medications. The lawyers set up it all looked like a carefully maintained legend. On the same day, Detective Justin Hill met with Robert Manning, a friend of the Hahn family who knew Jonathan Broyhill well. They met at the office where volunteer meetings had previously been held. Robert himself contacted the police, wanting to share an important detail. He said that he had talked to Jonathan about his diagnosis on several occasions, sympathized with him, and once even gave him money for medicine. The amount was small, but the fact that he trusted him was significant. When Hill asked if he had seen any medical documents, Robert replied, "No, it was all verbal." I didn't doubt him. We were friends. This episode added another element to the picture. Jonathan not only talked about his illness, but also accepted help, both financial and moral, under the pretext of it. Against this backdrop, the police continued to analyze the contents of Jamie's laptop. One of the drafts found in the drafts folder was an internal memo titled "Financial Inconsistencies, Urgent." It mentioned specific dates, amounts, and Jonathan's last name without providing any context. The file had not been sent but was dated 2 days before the incident. This suggested that Jamie was planning to take some action based on the analysis of the reports. Perhaps to discuss the problem with her husband, perhaps with Jonathan himself. By the end of April 23, investigators had several pieces of information that did not yet add up to a charge, but formed a pattern of alarming coincidences. Jonathan Broyhill was at home at the time of the incident. His name appeared in documents with suspicious financial transactions. Despite all these circumstances, the official report still did not name a suspect. The investigation remained cautious. Police representatives at a briefing on the evening of April 23 stated, "The work continues. The circumstances and materials are being analyzed. Any versions will be announced only after the initial stage is complete." Meanwhile, the press began to speculate. The first discussions appeared on social media, but the names of those involved remained unnamed. The public knew only one thing. Something inexplicable had happened in the house where two respected people lived, and where everything had seemed perfectly normal until the very last moment. The morning of April 24 began with silent anticipation, but ended in a tragedy that could no longer be explained as an accident or misunderstanding. At 7:39 a.m., the Raleigh Police Department received an official report from Wake Med Hospital. Jamie Hahn had died from her injuries. Despite the efforts of medical personnel, her condition had deteriorated throughout the night. Doctors pronounced her dead from a combination of massive blood loss and internal organ damage. The news spread quickly, first through official channels, then reaching the media. Jamie's name was made public for the first time. Her death marked the transition of the investigation from the fact-finding stage to the legal prosecution phase. Almost simultaneously, forensic experts began their work at the city morgue. The report, prepared closer to noon, described the location and nature of the injuries. The conclusion contained wording that allowed for an unambiguous conclusion. The injuries were inflicted at close range, with a household weapon, with the direct intent to cause harm. Traces of a struggle on the body indicated an attempt to defend himself. The expert group noted separately that the blows were aimed at vital areas. This confirmed the theory that the attack was deliberate. At the same time, digital materials were being processed. The police department's cybersecurity service analyzed the contents of Jonathan Broyhill's phone and email. The browser logs contained searches made several days before April 22, how to disappear without a trace, legal ways to change your name, and traveling between states without documents. Some of these queries were deleted manually but were recovered from the system cache. Email correspondence also raised questions. One email sent a week before the events to a temporary email address contained alarming phrases: "I've lost control. Everything is getting out of hand. I can't hide anymore." A financial audit completed a reconciliation with election reports submitted by the campaign headquarters of former Congressman Bob Etheridge. Jamie's suspicions were entirely justified. The election account was the source of illegal transfers totaling more than $45,000. The transfers were disguised as payments for consulting services. Several signatures were found to be forged. A graphological analysis showed that the handwriting did not match Jamie Hahn's originals. Jonathan Broyhill was listed as the approving person. He signed the reports himself without management approval. The money was transferred to accounts registered in the names of third parties associated with him at his place of residence. At around 3:30 p.m., the police obtained a search warrant for Jonathan's apartment. The address was in Durham, North Carolina, a one-room apartment in a residential complex on the outskirts of the city. A team of 4 officers and a homicide detective arrived at the scene. Jonathan was under administrative supervision at the time, but had not yet been named as an official suspect. However, the results of the search put an end to any doubt. Inside the apartment, everything was neat, almost sterile. In the closet were 2 folders with medical documents, including copies of certificates with the logos of medical institutions where, as was later confirmed, he had never been examined. Upon closer inspection, it turned out that most of the seals were digital copies printed on a printer. Next to them were blank forms, brochures from cancer centers, and questionnaires, some of which had been partially filled out by hand. Among his personal papers was a stack of letters, some in envelopes addressed to Jamie and Nation Hahn. None of them had been sent. Almost all of them contained vague apologies, phrases about trust, feelings of guilt, and fragments presumably written in a state of extreme agitation. "I wanted to be better," one read. Another said, "I couldn't stop. I was afraid. I'm sorry." The laptop confiscated from the apartment showed activity on the day of the incident. Several files were deleted about an hour before the visit to the Hahn home. One of them was a text document titled Exit Plan NXT, which was recovered using specialized software. Inside was a list of possible actions: go west, leave a note, take only cash. There were also saved drafts of letters, including one presumably addressed to his parents. These materials were seized and added to the case file. At 6 p.m. that day, the Raleigh Police Department held a press briefing. For the first time since the investigation began, an official statement was made. Jonathan Broyhill is charged with first-degree murder in the death of Jamie Hahn and aggravated assault causing serious injury to Nation Hahn. His status was changed from a person in custody to a person under arrest. He was read his rights. He did not respond to the charge. According to officers, he behaved calmly during the procedure, did not resist, and did not ask any questions. Thus, less than 2 days after the attack, the investigation completed its initial phase. Evidence was collected. The link between financial fraud and the events of April 22 was confirmed, and a motive began to emerge. A trial lay ahead, but even at this stage, the public began to realize that what had happened was not a spontaneous conflict. It was the result of a well-thought-out, albeit desperate plan. A plan born of fear, lies, and mounting internal pressure. The trial of Jonathan Broyhill began in the spring of 2014, almost a year after the tragedy. During this time, investigators gathered an impressive amount of evidence. Financial documents, witness statements, digital forensics, medical examiner reports, and reconstructed correspondence. All of this material was handed over to the Wake County District Attorney's Office. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Douglas Fay, a man with a reputation as a tough but level-headed professional known for his previous high-profile cases. Jonathan was defended by attorney Charles Pearson, who specialized in cases with psychiatric components. From the outset, the defense's position was based on the argument that the defendant was not in a stable mental state and was acting under severe emotional distress. The hearings were held in Raleigh District Court, Courtroom No. 3. The case was heard by a jury. Public interest in the trial was high. Journalists, Jamie Hahn's colleagues, former political campaign staff, and members of non-governmental organizations were regularly present in the courtroom. For many, this trial was not only a legal but also a symbolic moment, an opportunity to get answers to the question of how and why the tragedy occurred in a home filled with trust. The trial lasted 9 days. Over 20 witnesses testified during the hearings. Nation Hahn took the stand on the third day, speaking calmly, pausing frequently as he recounted the events of that evening. He described in detail the moment when he heard his wife scream, rushed into the room, and saw her on the floor with a man they trusted standing next to her. He did not mention the man's name, leaving the fact of the attack to the investigation. Next to testify were employees of Sky Blue Strategies, friends of the family, and experts in digital technology and banking operations. During the interrogation by the prosecutor's investigator, handwriting analysis reports were presented confirming that the signatures on the campaign documents had been forged. The testimony of financial analysts confirmed the scheme for transferring funds to accounts, as well as Jonathan's involvement in preparing the reports that Jamie had tried to double-check in the days leading up to the incident. The defense attorney emphasized the emotional state of the defendant. Reports from psychologists were presented, indicating episodes of depression, high levels of anxiety, unstable sleep, and a tendency towards self-harm. The defense insisted that Jonathan's actions were not cold-blooded, but rather the result of mental deterioration caused by fear of exposure and a personal crisis. However, the conclusion of an independent forensic psychiatric commission presented in court indicated that the defendant was aware of the nature and consequences of his actions at the time of the crime. This conclusion became a key argument for the prosecution, confirming that Jonathan Broyhill acted with full understanding of what was happening, seeking to conceal financial crimes. The trial came to a head when the prosecutor presented a recovered document, Exit Plan, DNL, found on Broyhill's laptop, which contained a list of steps to disappear, including change name, leave without explanation, and delete evidence. This was the final piece of the prosecution's case, showing an intent to flee before, not after, the incident. After the trial, it took the jury less than 8 hours to reach a unanimous verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the verdict. On April 27, 2014, the Raleigh District Court found Jonathan Broyhill guilty of the following crimes: first-degree murder of Jamie Hahn, first-degree attempted murder of Nation Hahn, fraud using forged financial documents, and grand larceny of funds belonging to a federal election campaign. On May 2, 2014, Jonathan Broyhill was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Mary Griffiths was born on September 11, 1970, in Ipswich, Suffolk, into a middle-class family. Her parents, an office worker and a primary school teacher, provided her with a stable but strict upbringing, focused on independence and discipline. At school, Mary was determined and successful in the sciences, combined with a keen interest in physical activity. At the age of 11, she was already participating in county-level athletics competitions, demonstrating excellent coordination, endurance, and a will to win. After graduating from high school, she enrolled in a physical training college in Norwich, where she studied sports physiology and fitness training methods. After completing her studies, Mary did not immediately find a stable job in her field. For a while, she worked part-time at fitness clubs while also working as a personal trainer for private clients. Later, thanks to her reputation as a reliable and demanding instructor, she got a permanent position at the Bury St. Edmunds Sports Center, where she became one of the leading trainers by 2005. Mary raised 3 daughters, whom she gave birth to between 1999 and 2004. Her relationship with their father, to whom she was not officially married, ended long before the events described. According to acquaintances, she did not discuss this topic openly, focusing exclusively on raising her children and her professional activities. Mary's life appeared stable on the surface. She was respected by her colleagues, had a steady circle of clients, and gave the impression of a well-balanced person who could cope with all of life's difficulties. She met John McFarlane in 2008 in what seemed like an ordinary setting. He was a regular customer at a butcher's shop in the suburbs, where meat products were purchased for the sports nutrition center, and one day he ran into Mary at a local store. The acquaintance developed into a brief relationship, but according to friends, John's behavior was overly persistent from the very first weeks of their relationship. He regularly showed up at the club where Mary worked, offered to walk her home, and showed an interest in her daily life that was not always appropriate. Within a few months, Mary limited their communication and then stopped all contact. However, McFarlane's behavior did not change after that. According to colleagues, he continued to show up at the gym, sit in his car nearby, and pretend to be at the same store or on the same street by chance. Although he never broke the law in any obvious way, these actions caused Mary to feel a persistent sense of anxiety. She did not file a formal complaint with the police, but, as confirmed by official records, she repeatedly called the emergency hotline to express her concerns. The last call was made on the evening of May 5, 2009, at 9:37 p.m. In a brief conversation with the operator, she reported a man sitting in a car opposite her home and said she felt threatened. The call was logged but classified as low priority. No patrol was dispatched that evening. On the morning of May 6, 2009, a police task force arrived at Dunstall Walk, Bury, St. Edmunds, after receiving a call from neighbors concerned about strange noises and broken glass. Officers arriving at the scene found the body of a woman with signs of violent death inside the house. The identity of the woman was later established as Mary Griffiths. 3 girls who were in the house were found in the upper bedroom in a state of severe emotional distress. They were immediately taken into the care of the crisis services. The morning of May 6, 2009, in Bury St. Edmunds began with police sirens piercing the quiet of the suburbs. Several vehicles were moving along Dunstall Walk, a patrol car, an emergency response team, and child welfare officers. Forensic experts arrived at the red brick house at number 14. The information received by the duty officer a few hours earlier was alarming but still unclear. Neighbors reported the sound of broken glass at 3 in the morning, and by 7 it was known that a woman's body was inside the house. Access to the building was immediately restricted, the perimeter was cordoned off with tape, and local residents were moved back far enough to preserve evidence. The first thing that caught the eye when approaching the house was damage to the rear of the structure. The back door, which opened onto a small garden with a well-kept lawn and 2 plastic chairs, was completely destroyed. The glass insert had been smashed in, and the frame had dents from blows, judging by the depth and nature of the damage, which appeared to have been caused by a heavy, hard object. There were fragments of glass on the ground under the door and minor traces of blood along the edge of the frame, presumably from cuts made during the break-in. Glass shards were scattered inside the kitchen, and there were shoe prints on the floor leading to the hallway. No signs of a hasty search for valuables or chaotic behavior were found. The actions taken by the intruder were clearly limited: entry, movement along a straight route, and then what investigators described as the moment of final contact. The house was 2 stories high with a simple layout. Immediately behind the kitchen was a hallway with a wooden staircase leading upstairs. It was here, on the first step, that faint traces were found, footprints of a dragging object that left a barely discernible trail of dust and particles on the varnished surface. On the lower landing, at the foot of the stairs, lay the body of Mary Griffiths. She was dressed in pajamas, her hair was disheveled, and her right arm was in an unnatural position pointing toward the kitchen. Medical personnel at the scene pronounced her dead. The body showed signs of several puncture wounds in the chest and shoulder area, as well as traces of blunt force trauma to the face. According to forensic experts, these injuries were incompatible with life and indicated the use of a specialized tool capable of inflicting fatal injuries in a very short time. A few meters from the body, at the entrance to the kitchen, there was a metal device with signs of use. It was immediately identified by experts as a bolt gun, an industrial device used in the meat processing industry to quickly immobilize and stun cattle. Its presence at the scene became a key element of the investigation. Such devices are not available for sale to the general public, require a license or professional certification, and are manufactured in limited quantities in the United Kingdom. The serial number engraved on the body was preserved, which would later play a decisive role in establishing the owner and the route by which it ended up in Mary Griffith's home. As the search progressed, it became clear that the deceased's children were in the upper part of the house. They were found in a bedroom, locked from the inside. The eldest daughter, a 10-year-old girl, was in a state of extreme distress and reported that she had been awakened by screams and heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. She was unable to give a clear description of the figure, but noted that she saw the shadow of a man walking down the stairs. Further details could not be recovered due to the child's psychological state. The other two girls were younger and did not have any information that could be useful to the investigation. All three were taken to a crisis support center and accompanied by child psychologists. All rooms in the house, except for the kitchen and stairwell, were in complete order. In Mary's bedroom, there were dents on the bed from the recent presence of two people. Judging by their location, one of the daughters had probably slept with her mother. The window was closed, but the nightlight was on. A cell phone was lying on the bedside table, which was later seized by experts. The last number dialed was displayed on the screen, the police dispatch service. This confirmed the information about the call received the previous evening and reinforced the assumption that Mary was aware of the danger posed by someone close to her. However, she did not name anyone specifically. According to the forensic expert's conclusion, the perpetrator acted quickly. Within a short period of time, the intruder entered through the back door, then went upstairs, located the victim, made contact, and used a bolt gun. The whole thing took no more than a few minutes. Considering that the children did not hear any commotion or struggle, it was assumed that the perpetrator either took the victim by surprise or that she did not actively resist. No signs of a struggle or movement in other rooms were found. This suggested that the attacker knew the layout of the house, knew where the bedroom was, and had a clear goal: to get to Mary Griffiths as quickly as possible. The police noted that the nature of the intrusion and the behavior of the intruder ruled out the possibility of a spontaneous crime. The break-in took place at night using specialized tools, and the actions inside the house were quick and purposeful. No valuables were missing. No signs of tampering were found in the wallet, jewelry box, or among the electronics. On the contrary, everything indicated that the intruder was looking for only one person and left the scene immediately after carrying out his plan. A team of experts worked at the scene for several hours, collecting shoe prints, analyzing fingerprints, and interviewing neighbors. Several people from neighboring houses reported seeing a dark-colored car parked near the back fence earlier that evening. One witness recalled seeing a man in a hoodie standing by the trash cans and looking toward the house. There was insufficient information to create a composite sketch, but the fact that someone had been watching reinforced the theory that the crime had been planned. Commenting on the situation in the afternoon, the police said they were treating the crime as targeted and highly planned. The presence of specialized tools, knowledge of the layout of the house, and the absence of any signs of robbery all pointed to the fact that the crime was not random and was not the result of a domestic dispute. However, despite the initial findings, there were no specific suspects at that time. Thus, by the end of the first day of the investigation, the main facts had been established: the death of Mary Griffiths, the breaking and entering of the house, the presence of rare professional tools, the child's testimony about the presence of an adult male, and indirect evidence of surveillance of the house the day before. All these elements began to form a pattern, indicating intent and professional knowledge. However, the question of the attacker's identity remained open. The investigation had to not only reconstruct the events of that night, but also find out who exactly led Mary Griffiths to her last day, step by step, silently, but with clear intent. The day after Mary Griffiths' body was found, the investigation reached the stage where the information obtained at the crime scene began to be systematized. By this point, the investigative team already had a set of initial facts: the death of a woman in clearly violent circumstances, breaking and entering at night, no signs of robbery, and the presence of a bolt gun, an item requiring professional access. All of this suggested that the perpetrator did not act impulsively. He was well prepared, knew how to break into the house, had access to a specialized weapon, and was pursuing a clearly defined goal. These circumstances narrowed the circle of possible suspects, directing the police's attention to the victim's personal circle. The first step was to investigate Mary's connections. Officers interviewed her colleagues at the fitness club, close friends, and the parents of her children's classmates. As a result, a picture began to emerge that was not immediately obvious, but gradually became crucial. Several people who worked with Mary independently mentioned a man they had seen near the sports center. He did not attend classes, was not registered as a client, but was repeatedly seen in the parking lot sitting in his car and watching the entrance to the gym. These incidents were regular and occurred not just on one day, but over a period of weeks. According to descriptions, he was a middle-aged man of strong build with graying temples, dressed in clothing without any distinctive features. His behavior was not aggressive, but it made the staff wary. However, no one contacted the police, assuming that he might be a relative of one of the clients or the partner of one of the employees. It was only after Mary's death that these observations took on a completely different context. It turned out that one evening a month before the tragedy, the club manager, closing up for the night, saw a man get out of a car and head toward the entrance, but when he noticed her looking at him, he turned around and left. At the time, she thought it was strange, but not threatening. This fact was subsequently recorded in an official report. Additional information began to emerge from Mary's close circle. Friends with whom she had been in contact in recent months mentioned that she had repeatedly expressed concern about one of her former acquaintances. According to them, Mary did not want to go into details, but said that she felt uncomfortable and afraid of a certain person with whom she had previously had a brief romantic relationship. This was a man with whom she had broken up in 2008, after which he continued to show excessive attention. He repeatedly showed up uninvited, sent messages, and once left flowers at her home. Although these actions were not overtly threatening, Mary perceived them as controlling and intrusive. That is why, according to her, she limited her communication with him and changed her route from home to work. This information led investigators to focus on the question, which of her former acquaintances could have had both an emotional motive and access to specific technical equipment? Given the bolt gun found at the crime scene, the police sent an official request to the Meat Hygiene and Inspection Authority to find out who in the region had licensed access to such devices. The results of the request led to a surprisingly short list. There were only 2 such businesses within a 20-kilometer radius of Bury St Edmunds, and both kept strict records of the equipment they issued. At the same time, work was carried out on the phone calls. Mary's call to the police on the day before her death was listened to several times. In the conversation, she describes a man sitting in a car outside her home and says she feels threatened. Although no name was mentioned, the officer who took the call noted in his report that this was not the first report from the caller. According to internal police regulations, such reports should have been documented as stalking, but the case was not pursued due to the lack of a written statement. It was this oversight that became the subject of an internal investigation in the following months. Meanwhile, forensic experts completed their initial analysis of the bolt gun found in the house. The device was registered to a company located 4 kilometers from the scene. The serial number matched one of the copies issued to slaughterhouse employees, and according to records, the last person to use it was a man named John McFarlane. This information was immediately forwarded to the task force. A check of public databases confirmed that this citizen had previously lived in the same area and, several years ago, had worked for the company that owned the tool. He was dismissed in 2008 for internal reasons related to disciplinary violations. The match between the name and the information obtained from Mary's friends allowed investigators to form a preliminary theory about his possible involvement. Investigators began checking his past, contacting his former employers, and gathering information about his behavior after he was fired. It was established that McFarlane had not been officially employed anywhere for the past few months. He lived alone, drove a dark gray Ford Mondeo and had no registered emergency calls. However, a surveillance camera from one of the neighboring houses on Dunstall Walk recorded a car matching this description parked near Mary's house on the night of May 5-6. The image did not allow the license plate to be recognized, but the outline of the model and the direction of travel matched the suspected route of the perpetrator. With all this info, access to a weapon, past connections to the victim's suspicious behavior, and signs of surveillance, the investigation team decided they needed to find John McFarland right away. At this stage, his status was not officially defined as a suspect, but he was considered a person with information of interest and of potential operational significance. A summons for questioning was issued in his name, and a team was dispatched to the area where he was believed to be living to interview neighbors. Thus, the body of circumstantial evidence gathered in the first days of the investigation, from observations at the sports club to CCTV footage and analysis of professional equipment, allowed investigators to form their first working theory. It did not yet have any procedural weight, but it outlined the contours of a figure that the investigation would come to focus on in the hours that followed. At the center of this scheme, a man was emerging who Mary Griffiths had once broken off contact with, but who apparently did not consider this to be the end. After the investigation identified John McFarland as a potential suspect in the crime, the investigation was accelerated. The key focus was on determining the route taken by the bolt gun used in the murder. Police officers sent a request to the administration of a meat processing plant located a few kilometers from the scene of the crime to find out which employee had been issued a tool matching the number found in Mary Griffiths' house in the previous months. The response from the slaughterhouse office arrived within 6 hours. The bolt gun found at the crime scene had indeed been on the equipment list issued to an employee named John McFarland in 2008. His signature was in the logbook for the receipt and return of special tools, and the last entry regarding its use coincided with the period prior to his dismissal. McFarland worked at the slaughterhouse from 2004 to 2008, where he worked as a slaughterer. During this time, he was never subject to disciplinary action, but according to former colleagues, he was withdrawn, excessively silent, and prone to isolation. After his dismissal, he did not return the bolt gun, claiming that the tool had been lost, and, according to internal company procedures, the matter was not pursued further. Later, in 2009, when the police began their investigation, it turned out that the report on the unreturned tool had not been forwarded to the accounting department, and the fact of its loss had not been officially recorded anywhere. This omission became an additional argument in favor of the version that the murder weapon had been brought to the victim's home by this particular individual. At the same time, forensic laboratory staff analyzed video files obtained from surveillance cameras installed on private homes and street lamps in the neighborhood. One of the videos, taken on the night of May 6, clearly showed a dark-colored Ford Mondeo slowly driving down Dunstall Walk. A camera mounted on the facade of a neighboring house captured the moment when the car stopped 100 meters from Mary Griffiths' house. The driver did not get out of the car but turned off the headlights and remained inside for almost 15 minutes. Later, the image becomes blurry, but the fact that the car was there and what it was doing at night became important clues. Since McFarland owned a car of that model and the registration info matched what he had given for his address, investigators decided to arrest him. At dawn the next day, May 8, the investigation team arrived at the address listed in the database, a small house on the outskirts of Ipswich where McFarland lived alone. The arrest operation was carried out without much fuss. Officers surrounded the house, secured the perimeter, and entered after presenting a warrant. The suspect was in the living room, offered no resistance, and said very little. According to one of the officers, he did not appear panicked, but there was a sense of inner tension. He was dressed in casual clothes and did not have a cell phone. During a search conducted in the presence of witnesses, several items of particular interest were found. In one of the rooms there were clothes, a jacket and trousers with dried traces of a substance visually resembling traces of biological fluids. samples were taken and sent for examination. In addition, a set of work gloves, similar to those used at the slaughterhouse, was found in a kitchen cupboard. Chemical analysis later showed that the fabric of the jacket contained traces of compounds identical to those found on the kitchen floor in the victim's home, as well as microparticles matching the structure of the bolt gun handle. McFarland remained silent at the police station. He refused to answer any questions from investigators. His behavior did not show signs of emotional distress, but experts noted that he appeared detached and completely uninvolved in what was happening. The lawyer assigned to him did not make any statements to the press, citing the need to organize the case materials. Meanwhile, investigators continued to organize the evidence. At the same time, the slaughterhouse employees were questioned again. One of McFarland's former colleagues recalled that he had repeatedly mentioned a woman named Mary, whom he had been dating, but who, according to him, had ruined his life. According to the witness, these statements were emotional, but were perceived as normal conversation in the smoking room. However, in light of recent events, this recollection gained weight and was added to the case file. It also emerged that McFarland had a habit of keeping lists of contacts and routes in written notebooks. One of these, seized during a search, contained the addresses and opening hours of several gyms, including the one where Mary Griffiths worked. After all the initial steps were done, the police put out a press release saying that a guy who had been linked to the victim was arrested as part of the investigation and that all the evidence pointed to him being really involved in the crime. The investigation kept going, but the official statements made it clear that they had their main suspect. The wording used in the publication was unequivocal. There is no doubt about the involvement of the suspect. Thus, the investigation had progressed from the initial analysis of the crime scene to the arrest of the alleged murderer, relying on professionally gathered evidence, witness statements, surveillance footage, and expert reports. All the pieces fell into place, with John McFarland becoming central not only to the material reconstruction of events, but also to the emotional context of this tragedy. The man who had once been excluded from Mary Griffith's life returned at a time when she was expecting protection, but did not receive it in time. The trial for the murder of Mary Griffith began in the spring of 2009 at the Royal Court of Ipswich. The case caused a public outcry and attracted the attention of both local and national media. The submission of materials to the court was accompanied by heightened security, restrictions on press coverage until the conclusion of the main hearings, and strict confidentiality regarding juvenile witnesses. During the preliminary hearings, the court found that there was sufficient evidence to bring a criminal case and allow it to proceed to trial. The defendant, John McFarland, was found to be sane and capable of being held responsible for his actions, and participated in the hearings in person, although he refused to make any statements on the substance of the charges throughout the investigation and trial. The hearings lasted several weeks. Prosecutors presented a complete reconstruction of events based on crime scene analysis, technical evidence, CCTV footage, and testimony from witnesses. Mary Griffith's colleagues, her friends, and employees at the slaughterhouse where the defendant had previously worked. The court paid particular attention to the bolt gun found at the crime scene. Forensic ballistics established a direct link between this device and the one issued to McFarland at his previous place of work. The serial number, signs of wear on the parts, and biological material found on the handle matched samples taken from the suspect. This piece of evidence became one of the cornerstones of the prosecution's case. Equally important was video footage obtained from a surveillance camera on a neighboring house. It showed a Ford Mondeo in the immediate vicinity of Mary's house at night when the crime was believed to have taken place. The license plate could not be identified, but experts confirmed that the model, color, and configuration matched the vehicle registered to John McFarland. Witness statements added to the picture. Gym employees and the victim's friends described multiple instances of McFarland's stalking behavior, his regular presence at the club, and Mary's complaints to the police about being harassed. Although these incidents had not been recorded in the criminal case file, they provided the court with the context necessary to understand the victim's emotional state prior to her death. The defense built its case on the denial of intent and the lack of direct evidence that McFarlane had delivered the fatal blows. His lawyers argued that the presence of a bolt gun at the crime scene did not mean that the defendant had used it. The absence of fingerprints and direct witnesses to the attack were used as arguments to cast doubt on the prosecution's version of events. However, the court found that the totality of the circumstantial evidence, the logical structure of events, the biological traces on the clothing, and the coincidence of circumstances left no reasonable room for alternative interpretations. The hearings took place under heightened scrutiny. The courtroom was attended by Mary Griffith's relatives, representatives of witness protection services, court psychologists, and journalists with access to the case files. The defendant's behavior elicited mixed reactions. He remained calm, avoided eye contact with the audience, and showed no emotion during the prosecutor's statements or the reading of the testimony, including that of the victim's children. His silence, unaccompanied by any denial of guilt or remorse, was interpreted by the court as a deliberate detachment rather than a legal calculation. After the closing arguments, the presentation of evidence, and the closing statements of the parties, the judge, accompanied by the jury, retired to deliver the verdict. The deliberations lasted less than a day. In the court's opinion, the volume of material presented provided a complete and consistent picture of what had happened. The verdict was announced in the courtroom the very next day. On May 25, 2009, the Suffolk Crown Court found John McFarlane guilty of the murder of Mary Griffiths and of unlawfully entering her home with intent to cause harm. On May 26, 2009, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Bradley Lewis was born on October 15, 1997, in Kingswood, a small town in southwestern England, where he spent his life. His family was typical of many English working-class families. His father worked at a local factory, and his mother worked at a small pharmacy. Bradley was the only child in the family, and this may have played a role in shaping his character. From an early age, he was a source of pride for his parents, a kind and caring young man who tried not to disappoint them. At school, Bradley was not only a good student but also an active participant in school life. He was into sports, especially football, and was pretty popular with his peers. His grades were solid, and after high school, he decided to go to college to continue his education. He chose a business management major, hoping to work in the business world in the future. However, his college career didn't last long. After his first year, Bradley felt that education was not fulfilling for him and decided to change the course of his life. After Bradley left school, he returned to Kingswood, where he got a job at a construction company. His hard work and determination allowed him to quickly secure a stable position in the company. He was known among his colleagues as a reliable and honest worker who was always willing to help others when they found themselves in difficult situations. In his free time, Bradley often spent time with friends, participating in various activities, and also found solace in active recreation, such as cycling and fishing. At some point in his life, Abigail White came into his life. It happened about 2 years ago when they met at a party at a pub where Bradley often spent his evenings with friends. Abigail was a bright and confident young woman who immediately caught Bradley's attention. She was a few years younger than him, but they quickly found common ground and began a relationship. Abigail, like Bradley, was from a small town, but her life had been much more difficult. She was independent and ambitious, not limiting herself in her choice of career opportunity. Their relationship developed rapidly, and a few months after they met, they moved in together. Bradley was impressed by Abigail's determination, her ambition, and her desire to improve her life. She often supported him in his plans and endeavors. Together, they began to make plans for the future, and Bradley even considered continuing his education and returning to school. But his career ambitions still came first. Abigail also seemed like his complete opposite, which at some point attracted him even more. The couple got to know each other's friends and sometimes spent time outside the city, relaxing in small cottages in the suburbs of Kingswood. It seemed like a typical romantic story of a young couple, but, as in many relationships, there were difficulties. They would argue from time to time, but they always made up, and Bradley often said that Abigail was the person he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. There was a lot of good in their relationship, but despite this, there was always something in the air, a tension that eventually came to a head. On March 25, 2022, on that fateful evening, Bradley and Abigail spent the day together. As usual, they went to their local pub where Bradley met up with a few friends. The evening promised to be quiet, and as always, the locals gathered at the pub to spend time together and enjoy a drink. But as often happens, the evening did not end as they had planned. An argument broke out between Bradley and Abigail. By the time they left the pub, the tension between them was at its peak. Outwardly, nothing unusual was happening, but both were clearly in an agitated state. Bradley felt that the relationship was becoming complicated, and Abigail was upset that she had not been supported in an argument with several people she had encountered at the pub. The couple left the pub, and upon returning home, Abigail discovered the unimaginable. Bradley was lying in the kitchen with a stab wound to his chest. His breathing was weak, and despite her attempts to help, she was unable to save him. Abigail panicked and dialed 911, but the paramedics who arrived a few minutes later were unable to do anything. Bradley was dead. The police arrived at the scene, but it was not immediately clear what had happened. Abigail claimed she did not know how it had happened, and although there were obvious traces of blood, the accident theory did not seem plausible. This marked the beginning of an investigation, but the police were still unable to answer the main question: who was involved in the murder of Bradley Lewis? Description of the crime scene. When the police arrived at the scene, the situation in the house was fairly normal, which immediately alarmed the investigators. There were no obvious signs of a struggle or damage to the premises. Only two people were in the house: Abigail White and her deceased boyfriend, Bradley Lewis. Bradley was lying in the kitchen. Next to him on the floor was a knife with obvious traces of blood, but otherwise the scene looked quite ordinary. The only exception was the blood that covered part of the floor and kitchen surfaces, apparently left behind from the severe stab wound that caused Bradley's death. According to the police, Abigail was in shock. When she saw the officers arrive, she immediately began to tell them what had happened. Her speech was confused and sometimes interrupted, but the main points remained the same. She had tried to help Bradley, but he had died. She claimed that when they returned home, she and Bradley had continued to argue, but then he had suddenly been injured. Abigail explained that it was some kind of misunderstanding that led to the tragedy. Her words betrayed her confusion and fear, and although her testimony seemed sincere, it did not give investigators a clear picture of what had happened. Abigail approached Bradley with a knife to scare him, to shock him. She claimed that she had no intention of hurting him, but before she realized what had happened, the knife was in his chest. It all happened so fast that she didn't have time to comprehend what had happened. According to her, it was all over before she realized what she had done. When she realized that Bradley was seriously injured, she immediately tried to help him. Abigail said that she helped Bradley take off his clothes to stop the bleeding. She claimed that they did it together, but there was no time to save him. She helped him move to the kitchen, trying to use his t-shirt to cover the wound. Bradley sat down at first, but then his body fell and he was lying on his back. That was when Abigail realized that her efforts were futile. Bradley was dead. When the police questioned her, Abigail initially claimed that Bradley had injured himself. She said she didn't know how it had happened and that she was sure there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Several important questions immediately arose. Why couldn't she give a clearer explanation of what had happened in the house? Why wasn't she sure what had happened? These questions seemed important, and investigators knew they had to proceed very carefully so as not to overlook any details. Abigail claimed that she did not know who could be responsible for what had happened, and that she herself could not have struck Bradley. She also stated that when she saw him injured, she immediately tried to administer first aid, but it was too late. However, her story did not match the facts at the scene. In the kitchen where Bradley's body was found, there was a knife that turned out to be the murder weapon. It was found next to the body and looked like a regular kitchen knife. There were no other suspicious items in the room. This also alarmed investigators. Usually in cases of domestic murders, the killer or criminal leaves behind not only the victim, but also clues that can reveal their motives and the course of events. But in this case, there was nothing of the sort. All that remained was the knife, blood on the floor, and a few strange details in Abigail's testimony. Investigators began collecting evidence. Traces of blood were found on the floor where Bradley lay, but there were no obvious signs of a struggle in the house. There were no scattered items, broken or damaged objects, nothing that could indicate violence. Only the knife and traces of blood on the surface, combined with Abigail's incomplete and contradictory statements, led to the conclusion that something in this picture did not add up. She kept repeating that she didn't see who could have inflicted the wound, and despite her apparent distress, investigators began to doubt her story more and more. Was her testimony sincere, or was she hiding the truth? There were several theories that piqued the investigators' interest. The first was that Abigail could have accidentally fatally wounded Bradley during the altercation. However, even in this case, many questions remained. Why couldn't she give more precise answers about what had happened? Why couldn't she say exactly how it happened if her version of an accident was true? The second theory was that Abigail might have been involved in a premeditated murder. Perhaps the argument was the catalyst for her actions, and when the situation got out of control, she decided to take the ultimate step. But despite these theories, investigators did not have enough evidence to say for sure what happened on that fateful evening. There were no witnesses in the house, and the surveillance camera at the pub could not provide accurate information about how the argument between Abigail and Bradley continued after they returned home. She only recorded a general moment of their conflict at the pub, which did not seem significant enough to cause such a tragedy. Around the same time that investigators discovered that Abigail had changed her story several times, they began to ask themselves new questions. There were no unusual signs of violence at the crime scene, which in theory could indicate that it was not an accident. From that moment on, the investigation was just beginning. Time and the collection of evidence would eventually reveal the truth about what happened that night. However, each step brought the investigators closer to a definitive answer, although at that point, none of the theories could be confirmed. After the police began their investigation, CCTV footage from the pub where Abigail and Bradley had argued before returning home became an important part of the investigation. The cameras captured the argument, but unfortunately they did not show what happened inside the house when the couple returned. These recordings only confirmed that a serious argument had taken place between them, but they were unlikely to be decisive evidence in establishing what happened later. The police could not rely solely on these images, as they did not show what was happening inside the house. This was the first major obstacle in the investigation for the investigators, as the murder had taken place inside the house, and now they had to find out what had actually happened between the two people after they left the pub. When Abigail was questioned, her testimony began to change, which immediately caught the attention of investigators. At first, she claimed that she had not seen anything, that she did not know how Bradley had been injured, and that events had unfolded too quickly for her to comprehend. She claimed that it was all an accident, and that she could not explain who could have stabbed him or how. However, her story later became contradictory. Abigail admitted that during the argument, she had taken a knife from the kitchen. She explained that she had only intended to scare Bradley, but could not explain why the knife ended up in his chest. This admission raised many questions for investigators. At first glance, her confession seemed sincere, but the contradictions in Abigail's story immediately made investigators suspicious. Why did she first claim that she saw nothing, and then admit that she took the knife from the kitchen? Why did she choose that particular moment to confess her role in what had happened? Investigators began to realize that her testimony might be distorted, which could mean that she was hiding important details or trying to justify her actions. The investigation had reached a point where it was necessary to gather as much information as possible to confirm or refute Abigail's testimony. The police continued to collect evidence. The testimony of neighbors played an important role in this process. Although they had not witnessed the crime itself, they were able to describe the couple's behavior in the days and weeks leading up to the tragedy. Some neighbors said that Abigail and Bradley's relationship had become more tense recently, that they had been arguing frequently, and that both seemed to be going through difficult times. This testimony helped investigators form a more complete picture of what was going on in their lives. However, the most important element of the investigation was the analysis of the bloody traces found in the house. When investigators examined the crime scene, they noticed details that could indicate that the murder was not accidental. The blood left on the floor and kitchen surfaces suggested that the knife wound was inflicted while Bradley was conscious and trying to respond to Abigail's actions. Blood stains on various parts of the kitchen indicated that he had tried to move, but his condition was deteriorating, which was consistent with Abigail's account of how she tried to help him after the wound was inflicted. All of this formed an important picture of the events that investigators had to piece together. The police also analyzed the knife found near Bradley's body. It was a standard kitchen knife with no particular features indicating that it had been used as a murder weapon beforehand. However, experts found that the knife was sharp enough to inflict a fatal wound with a single blow to the chest. What was surprising was that the knife was found next to Bradley's body and not in Abigail's hands, which made investigators wonder why she did not try to dispose of the murder weapon if it was indeed an accident. These details seemed strange and suggested that something in her story did not add up. The medical examiner confirmed that Bradley's death occurred quickly after he was wounded. She explained that the injury was fatal and that death most likely occurred within minutes of the blow. This fact was further evidence that the entire scene of Bradley's death was at least partially staged and that her actions were not accidental. This, of course, did not prove Abigail's direct involvement in the murder, but it became clear that she could have been involved to a significant extent. The evidence gathered and the testimony of neighbors increasingly pointed to the fact that the relationship between Abigail and Bradley was indeed tense, and that she probably made the decision to act without hesitation during the argument. Investigators began to piece together a picture of how their conflict-ridden relationship could have led to tragedy. Witness statements and analysis of the crime scene confirmed that the argument that triggered the tragedy was not accidental. Each new piece of evidence further convinced investigators that Abigail could have been involved in the murder and that she had tried to hide the truth about her actions. Now the investigators were faced with the task of not only uncovering the events of that fateful evening, but also understanding what could have prompted Abigail to make such a decision. To do this, they needed to continue gathering evidence, and each piece could be the key to solving the mystery. One thing was clear: the case was becoming increasingly complicated, and it was important to find the moment that could explain what really happened on that fateful evening that ended in tragedy. On March 28, 2022, a few days after the tragedy, Abigail White was arrested. Investigators, carefully analyzing all the evidence and testimony gathered, concluded that she was involved in the murder of Bradley Lewis. At that point, the investigation had sufficient grounds for suspicion. Abigail's contradictory statements, her inability to accurately explain what happened in the house, and numerous inconsistencies in her stories became increasingly apparent. At the same time, forensic evidence clearly confirmed that the stab wound that caused Bradley's death was inflicted intentionally, not accidentally, as Abigail herself claimed. These facts convinced investigators that Abigail may have been not only a witness to the tragedy, but also a direct participant. Abigail's arrest was an important turning point in the investigation. Despite her emotional testimony, full of fear and confusion, the police could not ignore the obvious inconsistencies and the growing amount of evidence pointing to her possible guilt. She continued to insist that she had no intention of killing Bradley and that what happened was an accident. However, her own confessions, which changed during the interrogations, became the main argument of the investigation against her. At one point, she admitted that she had taken a knife from the kitchen, but claimed that she had only intended to scare Bradley, not to fatally wound him. However, the lack of other obvious signs of violence and the flawed logic of her story contradicted this version of events. When the police presented Abigail with irrefutable evidence, her position changed. Investigators provided her with the results of a forensic medical examination, which showed that the wound inflicted on Bradley was severe and deliberate, indicating intentional action. The wound could not have been accidental. The knife had been plunged with such force that it caused death within minutes. Experts who examined the bloodstains found that the crime scene did not match the typical scenario of an accidental injury. In addition, evidence found in the house indicated that there had been no attempt to fight off the killer, which also cast doubt on Abigail's claim that it was an accident. Despite her attempts to justify her actions, investigators were convinced that she was responsible for Bradley's death. They believed that during the argument, which Abigail claimed began in the pub, she lost control of the situation. Nervousness, aggression, and pent-up emotions led her to decide to stab him. According to investigators, all of Abigail's actions that evening were the result of her rash behavior in a moment of emotional distress. When Abigail was arrested, she could no longer hide the fact that her actions had led to tragedy. Contradictions in her testimony began to work against her. At the time of her arrest, she was presented with concrete evidence, including surveillance footage from the pub, medical reports, and blood analysis results. This evidence showed that she had been actively involved in the incident and that her actions were deliberate. Investigators believed that she had not only struck the victim but also attempted to conceal the truth, possibly out of fear for her own life and the lives of her children. When Abigail was arrested, she was informed of her rights and the procedure for further action. The police conducted additional interviews with her, during which she did not deny that she had wounded Bradley, but again claimed that it was not done with the intention to kill. Investigators continued to insist that her actions were deliberate. At this stage, it became clear that Abigail was trying to mislead the investigation, which only served to strengthen suspicions. Later, analyzing the entire spectrum of events, investigators concluded that the quarrel between Abigail and Bradley in the pub was only the beginning of what led to the tragedy. The couple was experiencing serious emotional and psychological difficulties. Witnesses and neighbors reported numerous conflicts between them in recent months. Abigail repeatedly complained about Bradley, claiming that he did not support her. These circumstances only reinforced the investigators' version that during the argument at home, she was unable to control her emotions and decided to kill him. After her arrest, Abigail was taken into custody and preparations for the trial began. Investigators continued to gather all possible evidence to prove her guilt and prepare the final indictment. Every detail, every piece of information obtained from witnesses, analysis of bloodstains and other physical evidence, gradually pieced together a clear picture of what happened on that fateful evening. Abigail's arrest was an important milestone in the investigation. The police were confident that she was entirely responsible for Bradley's death, and their further work was focused on proving her guilt in court. Contradictions in her testimony and inconsistencies with the reality of the events continued to raise suspicions, and investigators were confident that the truth about what had happened would soon be revealed. The trial at Bristol Crown Court began with a detailed examination of the circumstances surrounding the crime that led to the death of Bradley Lewis. Abigail White was charged with the murder of her boyfriend, and her version of events was presented during the trial. She admitted her guilt in manslaughter but claimed that her actions were not intended to kill Bradley. Abigail explained that she took a knife from the kitchen to shock and scare Bradley, but did not realize what had happened until it was too late. She claimed that during the argument she was in a highly emotional state, lost control, and could not predict the consequences of her actions. However, evidence gathered during the investigation contradicted her testimony. A forensic medical examination showed that the knife wound was intentional and aimed at a vital part of the body. Surveillance cameras from the pub confirmed that there was a conflict between Abigail and Bradley, but could not clarify what happened in the house after the couple returned home. Also, bloodstain analysis at the crime scene, along with medical examiner data, showed that Bradley died quickly, which backed up the idea that the stab was meant to cause serious harm. Despite Abigail's admission of manslaughter, the judge and jury could not ignore the fact that her actions were the result of her aggressive emotions at the time of the altercation. Investigators and lawyers argued that Abigail had the opportunity to stop her actions but continued, which ultimately led to the tragic outcome. The court also considered her behavior after the crime, when she initially tried to conceal the true circumstances of what had happened, claiming that Bradley had injured himself. This behavior raised doubts about her sincerity and whether she truly understood the consequences of her actions. The couple's personal life was also discussed during the trial. The court proceedings revealed a lot of information about the toxic relationship between Abigail and Bradley. Witnesses testified about frequent arguments and heated conflicts that occurred in their lives. This added important information to the case, emphasizing that their relationship was extremely tense, which could have been a factor influencing Abigail's behavior at the time of the crime. Particular attention was paid in court to her emotional state. According to experts, Abigail was under severe psychological pressure due to accumulated relationship problems and her difficult life situation. The defense tried to prove that her actions were provoked by emotions and aggression caused by her difficult relationship with Bradley, which could have mitigated the punishment. However, despite her admission of manslaughter and the mitigating circumstances, the court was harsh in its decision. The prosecution insisted that her actions were deliberate and that she should be held responsible for Bradley's death. The judge and jury concluded that Abigail had inflicted a fatal wound on her partner as a result of aggression that crossed all boundaries, leading to the death of a person. Although she did not have the clear intention to kill Bradley, her actions were extremely dangerous and led to tragic consequences. The court also took into account her admission of guilt, which was a mitigating factor, as well as the fact that she did not hide her actions and confessed to the murder. However, despite her remorse, the court felt that the punishment should be severe to emphasize the seriousness of her actions. On October 21, 2022, Bristol Crown Court found Abigail White guilty of the murder of Bradley Lewis. The trial also revealed details of her toxic relationship with Bradley, as well as her behavior after the crime, which added further weight to the court's decision. The court ruled that Abigail White would be sentenced to life imprisonment. However, given her guilty plea and mitigating circumstances, the sentence was set with the possibility of applying for early release after 20 years. Anastasia Kamlovskaya, known online as Anastasia Grishman, was born on February 12, 1996 in St. Petersburg. From an early age, Anastasia showed an interest in art and self-development. Her family was characterized by an atmosphere of mutual support and respect for the individuality of each family member. Her parents, despite their different professions, always supported her desire for self-determination and developed her creative abilities. Anastasia grew up in a stable family. Her father was an engineer and her mother was an elementary school teacher. Her parents paid great attention to their daughter's upbringing, instilling in her a love of learning and culture. From childhood, Anastasia was quite independent and enjoyed being creative and doing things that inspired her. She began drawing at an early age, which led her to attend art school. At school, Anastasia excelled academically and was sociable, but she always remained somewhat reserved and disliked large gatherings, preferring small groups. After graduating from high school, Anastasia enrolled at St. Petersburg State University's Faculty of Arts and Design, where she discovered her passion for creativity and experimentation in various forms of self-expression. However, despite her academic success, she decided not to pursue an academic career, choosing instead to immerse herself in the world of fashion and social media. This decision was a turning point in her life. Anastasia realized that her future lay in the creative industry, and she sought to find ways to express herself that would be directly linked to her personality. For several years, she worked as a model for various photo shoots and developed her blog, posting photos and reviewing fashion trends. She soon attracted the attention of major brands and began working with renowned photographers. At some point, Anastasia realized that her place was not just in photo shoots, but in creating content that would be interesting to her audience. She then began actively working on adult platforms such as OnlyFans, where she could fully reveal her personality and express herself through candid photos and videos. Anastasia also started a popular TikTok account where she posted videos about her daily life, creating an image of an independent and confident girl. Soon her content began to attract more and more followers, and she gained immense popularity among her fans. This success on social media not only became her main source of income, but also opened up new horizons for her career growth. Her life was filled with exciting events, travels, and meeting interesting people. She did not limit herself to modeling, but also began to master the role of a tattoo artist, creating unique works for her clients. Tattoos became another important part of her life, and she proudly displayed her work on Instagram and other platforms. Anastasia was passionate about her work and worked hard to build a successful career in the world of fashion and art. However, despite her professional success, her personal life was less stable. Her relationship with Dmitry Chernyshov, her boyfriend, was increasingly fraught with tension, jealousy, and misunderstanding. Although Dmitry also worked in the adult industry and participated in the filming of erotic videos, his attitude toward Anastasia's success and popularity on social media remained complicated and contradictory. They met through mutual friends in the fashion industry and began dating when Anastasia was just starting to develop her career in the adult industry. Dmitry was attractive and charismatic, and their relationship began as a romantic story of mutual admiration and passion. He was very supportive of her endeavors and became her partner both in life and in her professional life, appearing on set with her. However, over time, their relationship became increasingly strained. Dmitry's jealousy of Anastasia's success and popularity on the internet began to grow stronger. This caused many conflicts between them, despite their outward harmony. Anastasia, despite constant problems in her personal life, continued to work and build her career, but her relationship with Dmitry became increasingly toxic and problematic. On August 2, 2022, Anastasia Kamlevskaya, a popular model and blogger known on OnlyFans and TikTok, went missing. She last communicated with her loved ones and friends, but soon stopped responding to messages. This date became fateful for her loved ones and friends, who could not imagine that their dear friend and colleague would disappear without a trace. In the first few days, her friend tried to call her but received no answer. She decided to take a step that shocked everyone even more. On August 3, 2022, after several unsuccessful attempts to contact Anastasia, her friend, filled with anxiety, turned to the police. The investigation into her disappearance began only a few days later when they came to the conclusion that the girl had indeed disappeared and her life could be in danger. On August 10, 2022, after several days of searching and concern from friends and relatives, police officers arrived at Anastasia Kamlevskaya's apartment, located on Yuzhny Highway in St. Petersburg. The apartment door was opened after a friend who had been unable to contact the girl since August 2 called the police. Concerned about her disappearance, the friend decided to report it to the police, and a few days later, following instructions from the investigation department, the police went to the apartment to check. When law enforcement officers entered the apartment, they immediately noticed a strange atmosphere. The room was quiet, and nothing indicated that it was a normal, everyday situation. However, as they searched the premises, the police came to a horrific conclusion. Anastasia's body was found in the bathroom. The bathroom was dimly lit, which only added to the grim impression of what they saw. The body was lying in the bathroom in a completely inappropriate place. An examination of the body immediately showed that death had been violent. There were multiple signs of bleeding on the body, indicating that she had been seriously injured. Several stab wounds on the body became key evidence pointing to a violent death. Soon, after a more thorough examination, investigators counted at least 6 stab wounds that had been inflicted on various parts of the body. The wounds covered the neck, chest, and abdomen. This indicated that the attack had been swift and brutal. What aroused further suspicion among investigators was the fact that the body had been moved to the bathroom. This was undoubtedly an attempt to hide the traces of the crime and change the scene of the apartment. The body was moved from the place where it was killed and left in the bathroom. This act was considered particularly significant, as moving the body indicated that the killer was aware of his action. Perhaps the perpetrator was trying to hide evidence, or later suggest that the death was accidental or did not occur at the time of the attack. However, despite these attempts to cover their tracks, other factors at the crime scene became key. After a thorough search of the apartment, the police found no signs of a struggle. No items were found at the scene that could indicate a fight or resistance on the part of the victim. This circumstance immediately caught the attention of investigators. The usual scenario for a murder in an apartment is usually a struggle. Screams, damage to furniture or other items in the room with which the victim could have fought the attacker. However, in this case, everything was different. No broken objects or damage to the walls or furniture were found, suggesting that the victim had not tried to resist. Moreover, the absence of signs of a struggle could also indicate that the perpetrator was familiar with Anastasia and that she may not have expected the attack. An important aspect that the investigation could not ignore was the condition of the apartment itself. Externally, the apartment looked neat, with no signs of violence or broken items in other rooms. However, the presence of the body in the bathroom, as well as the absence of signs of a struggle, suggested that the victim may have been taken by surprise. The perpetrator may have carried out the attack when Anastasia was not expecting any danger, which suggests that she probably trusted her killer or was calm enough not to resist. Further investigation revealed that Anastasia often stayed alone in her apartment because her job required her to work long hours and spend a lot of time online. According to her friends, she often worked at night creating content for social media. It was also known that her relationship with Dmitry Chernyshov, her boyfriend, was complicated, and they often quarreled. These facts could not fail to alarm investigators. Tension in the relationship, jealousy, and possible personal problems could have triggered the perpetrator to resort to violence. Interestingly, despite the absence of signs of a struggle, Anastasia's body showed signs that she was in a state of shock at the time of the attack. The autopsy showed that Anastasia had no opportunity to react to the attack, which also indicated that she was unprepared for it. This added to the suspicions surrounding Dmitry, who was the last person she had contact with before her disappearance. The investigative team focused on establishing what could have been the motive for such a brutal attack. During the investigation, witness statements were taken and possible motives for the murder were examined. Since there were no signs of a struggle at the crime scene, and the murder itself was quick and decisive, investigators assumed that the victim had no opportunity or desire to resist her killer. This strengthened suspicions about Dmitry, with whom Anastasia was in a relationship. The bloodstains found at the crime scene and the position of the body in the bathroom also became key elements of the investigation. This gave investigators grounds for further analysis of all factors that could have led to such a tragic outcome. The police continued to work on the case, and soon additional specialists were brought in to help analyze every detail related to the murder. After Anastasia Komlovskaya's body was discovered, investigators immediately began standard procedures to solve the crime, including interviewing the victim's friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. In the early days of the investigation, most of the people interviewed said that Anastasia was a cheerful, energetic person, but that her relationship with Dmitry Chernyshov was tense. This was confirmed by both her closest friends and people who knew the couple. Already during the questioning, when investigators were gathering information about her life and possible reasons for her disappearance, the first suspicions about her partner began to arise. Anastasia's friends and colleagues noted that her relationship with Dmitry had become increasingly problematic over time. Some even mentioned that the girl had complained several times about her boyfriend's jealousy. The testimony of these people played an important role in determining the direction of the investigation. Some of Anastasia's acquaintances said that she had repeatedly mentioned that her relationship with Dmitry was becoming increasingly difficult, especially in the last months of her life. According to her friends, he was very controlling and jealous of every man she interacted with, which could have caused tension in their relationship. There was information that Dmitry not only suspected her of cheating, but was also extremely sensitive to her popularity on adult platforms such as OnlyFans, where she received significant attention from men. One acquaintance even reported seeing Anastasia and Dmitry raise their voices and threaten each other several times during arguments. These conflicts became increasingly heated and emotionally charged, and it was unclear how the next argument would end. This gave reason to believe that against a backdrop of jealousy, discontent, and constant conflict, an emotional outburst could have occurred, leading to the tragedy. Although the police did not immediately raise any specific suspicions, they began to focus on Dmitry Chernyshov. Initially, investigators focused on general facts and connections that could shed light on Anastasia's disappearance and death, not ruling out the possibility of an accident or misfortune. However, with each interrogation, it became increasingly clear that Dmitry was the prime suspect in the murder. He was the last person to see Anastasia alive, and his relationship with her became the main focus of the investigation. Particular attention was paid to changes in Dmitry's behavior after Anastasia's disappearance. This behavior became a clear indicator that his involvement in the murder might be more obvious than initially thought. In the days following her disappearance, while friends and police began searching for Anastasia, Dmitry continued to actively correspond with her followers on social media. He used Anastasia's phone and responded to messages on her behalf. His actions raised suspicions as, despite the tragedy, he did not report her disappearance to the police and continued to behave as if everything was fine with the girl. It soon became clear that Dmitry was not just responding to messages but also interacting with subscribers on the OnlyFans platform, passing them off as her own. This behavior was extremely strange and suspicious. Some people who knew Anastasia began to notice inconsistencies in the manner of communication in these messages. They claimed that the responses sent on Anastasia's behalf were not characteristic of her communication style. This was an important clue for investigators, as such actions could mean that Dmitry was not just continuing to use her phone, but was also trying to cover up the crime by creating the illusion that she was still alive. Particular attention was paid to the fact that Dmitry did not report Anastasia's disappearance to the police and did not take any steps to find out what had happened to her. Instead of calling the police or starting a search, he continued his usual activities, responding to messages and even posting on behalf of his deceased girlfriend. This fact became the first serious evidence pointing to his involvement in the crime. The police were able to trace the correspondence and establish that this behavior was not simply a mistake or misunderstanding, but a deliberate act aimed at concealing the fact of the murder. After the investigation into the use of Anastasia's phone was deepened, additional evidence emerged confirming Dmitry's involvement. He tried to present the situation as if everything was fine, creating the illusion that nothing had happened to the girl. His attempts to hide the truth became increasingly obvious. At some point, investigators noticed other oddities in his behavior, such as his refusal to give precise explanations for his actions in the days following Anastasia's disappearance, and his strange behavior in ignoring all normal procedures after the tragedy. This fact finally undermined his alibi. Armed with all this evidence, investigators began to question Dmitry more thoroughly. They discovered that, despite his assurances that he knew nothing about her disappearance, he was in fact aware of what had happened and had attempted to cover up the crime. This behavior, as well as his active use of Anastasia's phone after her death, became the main evidence of his guilt. The use of the victim's phone, attempts to cover up the crime, and manipulation of information became key moments in the case that ultimately led to his arrest and indictment. Thus, Dmitry's actions after the murder were the main factor that allowed the investigation to draw the correct conclusions about his involvement in the crime. The police did not immediately reach a final conclusion, but gradually, step by step, the evidence of his guilt became increasingly clear. In the end, these facts helped put Dmitry Chernyshov on the trail of the crime and strengthened the case against him. On August 11, 2022, Dmitry Chernyshov was arrested on suspicion of murdering his girlfriend Anastasia Komlovskaya. The police arrested him shortly after establishing that he was the last person to see her alive, and after uncovering his suspicious behavior following her disappearance. Dmitry continued to use Anastasia's phone, responding to messages on her behalf, which became important evidence in the case. This behavior attracted the attention of investigators, as it was a clear sign of an attempt to cover up the crime. At first, Dmitry denied his guilt and tried to justify himself, telling investigators that Anastasia was depressed and had repeatedly asked him for help. He claimed that she was going through a difficult period in her life and could not cope with her inner demons. Dmitry stated that Anastasia had repeatedly told him about her desire to end her life, but could not bring herself to take this step. According to him, she asked him to help her because she saw no way out of her situation and could not cope with her depression. He claimed that at a certain point she asked him to kill her because she couldn't cope with the emotional pain. Dmitry's words sounded like an attempt to justify his actions and shift the blame to Anastasia's mental health. He claimed that her requests became a heavy burden for him and he didn't know what to do. In his testimony, he claimed that he could not refuse her and agreed to fulfill her request, believing that it would be a relief for her. However, as further questioning revealed, this version of events did not correspond to reality. The investigators did not believe this version of events. Their doubts were reinforced when it emerged that after the murder, Dmitry did not report what had happened to the police or to any of her relatives. He continued to respond to messages using Anastasia's phone, which, in light of his testimony, appeared to be an obvious attempt to cover up the crime and cover his tracks. This behavior only reinforced the police suspicions, and they continued to insist on a truthful confession. During further questioning, Dmitry finally confessed to the murder. He told investigators what had really happened and how events unfolded on that fateful night. Dmitry admitted that, despite all his attempts to justify himself to the police, he could not hide the truth. He stated that on that evening, they were lying on the bed in the bedroom when another argument broke out between them. Dmitry said that arguments with Anastasia were not uncommon, especially in the last months of their relationship, when she increasingly complained of depression and personal problems. This time, the conflict became particularly heated. According to Dmitry, at some point he took out a knife, which he said was nearby, and in a fit of rage, stabbed Anastasia several times in the neck. He noted that everything happened very quickly and he couldn't control his emotions. He admitted that he acted under the influence of aggression and jealousy that had been building up for a long time. Dmitry said that despite his cruelty, he did not want to kill Anastasia, but simply vented his aggression, not realizing the full gravity of his actions at the time. He said that after he realized what had happened, he moved Anastasia's body to the bathroom in an attempt to hide the traces of the crime. When investigators asked him why he moved the body to the bathroom, Dmitry replied that he wanted to avoid further trouble. He claimed that he decided not to report the incident to the police because he was confused and did not know how to justify himself to those around him. After that, he continued to respond to messages, trying to create the appearance that Anastasia was alive and well. He said he was trying to prevent her friends and followers from becoming upset, but in reality he was hiding his actions, which was an obvious attempt at manipulation. Dmitry's confession was an important step in solving the crime, but it did not answer all the questions. Investigators continued to examine all the details of that day's events, including possible motives and details that could shed light on why Dmitry chose to act in this way at that particular moment. One of the most important aspects investigators were looking for was motive. Dmitry claimed that his actions were caused by emotional instability and jealousy, but at the same time he did not explain why his behavior at that moment became so violent. The investigation also drew attention to the fact that after the murder, Dmitry continued to behave as if nothing had happened. Not only did he not report the crime to the police, but he also continued to use his deceased girlfriend's phone to communicate with her followers and acquaintances. This strange and inexplicable activity suggested that Dmitry was concerned about how the public would perceive his actions and wanted to hide the facts of the murder. His confession and subsequent testimony helped investigators establish an accurate picture of what happened, but the investigation did not end there. It was important to understand what exactly in their relationship triggered such an act: jealousy, personal conflicts, psychological problems. All of this turned out to be part of a complex picture that led to the tragedy. Thus, Dmitry Chernyshov's confession to the murder of Anastasia Khamlovskaya not only revealed all the circumstances of the tragedy, but also showed his actions after the crime, which became important evidence of his guilt. After Dmitry Chernyshev confessed to the murder of Anastasia Khamlovskaya, the case was referred to court. The trial began in 2023 and became a public trial that attracted public attention, especially given the tragic circumstances and brutality of the crime. The trial took place in the Frunzensky District Court of St. Petersburg. The trial examined key issues such as the motives for the crime, the defendant's behavior before and after the murder, and the evidence obtained during the investigation. Important evidence included Dmitry's confession, his behavior after the murder, and his actions to cover up the crime. Throughout the trial, Dmitry continued to claim that his actions were motivated by intense jealousy and personal problems in his relationship with Anastasia. He admitted that he was unable to control his emotions at the time of the attack, but claimed that he did not intend to kill the girl and only acted in a fit of rage. During the trial, the judge and prosecutor emphasized that the defendant's actions were deliberate and particularly cruel. Despite Dmitry's confession and attempts to justify himself, the prosecution pointed to the fact that the murder was committed with the clear intention of concealing evidence of the crime. An important factor for the court was the defendant's attempt to conceal the murder by continuing to respond to messages on Anastasia's behalf after her death, and by not reporting the incident to the police. These actions were considered an attempt to manipulate public opinion and conceal his involvement in the crime. During the hearings, testimony was also heard from witnesses, including Anastasia's friends and acquaintances, who confirmed that there were serious problems in the relationship between the defendant and the victim, including jealousy and emotional tension. The court hearings lasted several weeks. During the hearings, both sides presented their arguments. The defendant's defense claimed that Dmitry was acting under severe stress and did not realize the full gravity of his actions. In response, the prosecution presented facts confirming the premeditated nature of the murder, including Dmitry's actions after the crime. Psychological aspects were also considered, as the defendant had no previous convictions and no significant psychiatric disorders that could have influenced his behavior. The court found that the defendant was aware of the consequences of his actions and did not act in a state of affect or acute stress, as claimed by the defense. Although Dmitry did experience difficulties in his relationship with Anastasia and was influenced by his emotions, the court found that his actions were calculated and cruel. Psychological evidence did not justify his behavior, and the court took into account that he continued to manipulate the situation after the murder. After all the court hearings were completed, the defense and prosecution presented their conclusions. The prosecutor noted that despite the admission of guilt, the crime was not accidental and was not the result of a momentary outburst of aggression. The prosecution argued that Dmitry committed the murder in order to conceal his actions and manipulate those around him, which is an extremely serious crime. On January 22, 2024, the Frunzensky District Court of St. Petersburg found Dmitry Chernyshev guilty of the murder of his girlfriend, Anastasia Khamlovskaya. The court took into account all the evidence, including the defendant's confession, his behavior after the crime, and the investigation materials. It was established that the motive for the murder was personal animosity and jealousy, which escalated into violent actions. The court found that Dmitry acted with the clear intention of concealing the traces of the crime by continuing to use his deceased girlfriend's phone and responding to messages, creating the illusion that she was alive. Dmitry Chernyshev was sentenced to 8 years in a strict regime colony. The court took into account that, despite his admission of guilt, the defendant's actions were deliberate and cruel. The court also noted that the defendant's attempts to cover up the traces of the crime aggravated the severity of his actions. The sentence was handed down after a detailed analysis of all the circumstances of the case and taking into account that the victim was killed as a result of hostile relations, which indicates the high degree of danger posed by the defendant.